In the fog-shrouded halls of Ashford Manor, a lavish dinner turns deadly when Lord Reginald Ashford is poisoned in a locked study, with no trace of the killer. Enter Hercule Poirot, the brilliant detective whose sharp mind and cunning psychological trick unravel a web of secrets, lies, and betrayal. As tensions rise among family, friends, and foes, each hiding their own motives, Poirot's ingenious trap exposes the liar in a shocking twist no one sees coming. Will his little grey cells solve the impossible crime before the killer strikes again? Dive into a thrilling mystery where every glance, every word is a clue. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Invitation. The fog hung low over the rolling hills of the English countryside, curling like a living thing around the gnarled oaks and hedgerows that lined the narrow road to Ashford Manor. Hercule Poirot sat in the back of a sleek black Daimler, his gloved hands folded neatly over the silver head of his cane, his sharp eyes fixed on the misty landscape beyond the window. The air inside the car was warm, almost stifling, but Poirot's mind was as crisp as the autumn chill outside. He adjusted his perfectly knotted tie, a faint smile playing on his lips as he contemplated the peculiar summons that had brought him here. It had arrived 3 days prior, delivered to his London flat by a courier who vanished as quickly as he had appeared. The envelope was heavy cream stock, embossed with a crested lion rampant clutching a quill, the emblem of the Ashford family. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore the elegant, looping script of Lord Reginald Ashford himself, inviting Poirot to a weekend gathering at his ancestral home. The letter was brief, almost curt, but laced with an urgency that piqued Poirot's curiosity. "Your presence is requested," it read, "for matters of utmost importance. Discretion is paramount." No further details were provided, no hint of the nature of these matters. To a man of Poirot's temperament, such ambiguity was irresistible. The car slowed as it approached a pair of towering iron gates, their filigree work half hidden by the fog. The driver, a taciturn man with a face like weathered granite, leaned out to speak into an intercom. A moment later, the gates creaked open, and the Daimler glided up a gravel drive lined with ancient yews. Poirot's gaze sharpened as the manor came into view, a sprawling Elizabethan pile of red brick and leaded glass, its chimneys piercing the mist like sentinels. The house exuded grandeur, but also a certain melancholy, as if it bore the weight of secrets accumulated over centuries. As the car came to a halt, a butler emerged from the great oak doors, his posture ramrod straight despite his advanced years. He wore a black tailcoat that seemed to absorb the dim light, and his expression was one of practiced neutrality. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "Lord Ashford awaits you in the drawing-room. If you would, follow me." Poirot stepped out, his patent leather shoes crunching on the gravel. He adjusted his hatter's sleek fedora that complemented his immaculate suit and followed the butler into the manor. The entrance hall was a cavern of dark wood and flickering lamplight, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced Ashford glaring down from their gilded frames. A grand staircase swept upward, its banister carved with intricate vines. But the butler led Poirot through a side door into a corridor lined with tapestries. The drawing-room was a study in opulence, crimson, velvet drapes, a roaring fire in a marble hearth, and a chandelier that glittered like a constellation of stars. A dozen or so guests were already present, their voices a low hum over the clink of crystal glasses. Lord Reginald Ashford stood at the centre, a tall man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a hawkish face, his eyes, a piercing blue, locked On to Poirot's the moment he entered. Monsieur Poirot. Ashford's voice was warm, but carried an edge, like a blade wrapped in silk. How good of you to come. I trust your journey was pleasant. Most satisfactory, Lord Ashford, Poirot replied, bowing slightly. Though I confess, the mystery of your invitation has left me most intrigued. Ashford's smile tightened, a fleeting shadow crossing his face. All in good time, monsieur. Allow me to introduce you to our company. He gestured to the assembled guests, and Poirot's eyes swept over them, cataloguing details with the precision of a watchmaker. Lady Eleanor Ashford, Reginald's wife, stood near the fire, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her emerald gown shimmered, but her hands twisted nervously around a glass of sherry. Beside her was Charles Ashford, the nephew, a handsome man in his 30s with a restless energy, his fingers drumming on the arm of a chair. Dr. Simon Marlowe, a family friend and physician, leaned against a bookcase, his spectacles glinting as he studied the room with clinical detachment. Miss Clara Beaumont, Ashford's private secretary, hovered near a writing desk, her pale face framed by dark curls, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting an interruption. And finally, Mr. Harold Vernon, a burly man with a ruddy complexion, stood apart, nursing a tumbler of whiskey and eyeing Ashford with barely concealed disdain. Others filled the room: minor cousins, business associates, a local magistrate, but Poirot's attention lingered on these five. There was something in their postures, their glances, that suggested currents of tension running beneath the surface. He made a mental note to observe them closely during dinner. Dinner will be served at 8, Ashford announced, his voice cutting through the murmur. Until then, please make yourselves at home. Monsieur Poirot, may I have a word in private? Poirot inclined his head and followed Ashford to a corner of the room, where a pair of leather armchairs flanked a small table. Ashford poured 2 glasses of cognac from a decanter and handed one to Poirot, who accepted it with a polite nod, but did not drink. I will be direct, Monsieur Ashford said, lowering his voice. I have reason to believe someone in this house intends me harm. I cannot say who or why, but I have received indications, threats, perhaps, though they are veiled. I need your expertise to uncover the truth before it is too late. Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of his mind shifting into high gear. Threats, you say? Of what nature? Ashford hesitated, his fingers tightening around his glass. Anonymous notes left in my study, vague but menacing. References to secrets I thought long buried. And then there are the incidents. Things, a tampered lock, a missing key. I fear I am being watched. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And you suspect one of your guests? I suspect everyone, Ashford said grimly. Even those closest to me. That is why I need you, Poirot. Your reputation precedes you. They say you see what others cannot. Rest assured, Lord Ashford. Poirot said, his voice calm but firm. The little grey cells, they are already at work. But I must ask why. Invite these people, if you suspect them. Ashford's jaw tightened. To flush them out, to see who flinches. I trust you'll do the same in your own way. Before Poirot could respond, a gong sounded, deep and resonant, signalling dinner. Ashford drained his glass and stood. Come, let us join the others. And Poirot watched them closely. The dining room was as grand as the rest of the manor. Its long mahogany table set with silver and crystal that gleamed under the candlelight. Poirot took his seat, strategically placed near the head of the table, where he could observe all the guests. The meal began with a delicate consomme served by silent footmen, but the conversation was anything but light. Charles Ashford spoke loudly of his plans to modernize the family business, his tone bordering on arrogance. Lady Eleanor deflected questions about her charity work with practiced charm. Though her smile never reached her eyes, Dr. Marlowe offered dry remarks about the state of modern medicine, while Clara Beaumont said little, her gaze fixed on her plate. Vernon, meanwhile, made pointed comments about Ashford's recent financial decisions, each one laced with barely veiled hostility. Poirot listened, his fork poised delicately over his plate, his mind cataloguing every word, every glance. He noted how Charles's hand trembled slightly when he mentioned the family estate. He saw Lady Eleanor's quick glance at Dr. Marlowe when Ashford spoke of loyalty, and he observed Clara's sudden stillness when Vernon mentioned a recent audit of the company accounts. As the main course, roast pheasant with a truffle sauce, was served, Ashford rose to make a toast. "To family, friends, and truth," he said, raising his glass. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Poirot watched as the guests echoed the toast, their voices uneven. Vernon's glass remained untouched, his lips pressed into a thin line. The dinner progressed, but the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the fog outside had seeped into the room. Poirot's senses were on high alert, attuned to the smallest details. The clink of a spoon dropped too quickly, the flicker of candlelight on a nervous face, the faint creak of a floorboard in the hall beyond. He was about to ask Ashford a discreet question when a piercing scream shattered the air. The sound came from the direction of the study. The guests froze, their faces a tableau of shock and fear. Ashford stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Stay here," he ordered, striding toward the door. Poirot, however, was already on his feet, his cane in hand, his eyes alight with purpose. They reached the study to find the heavy oak door ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid scent of something chemical. Lord Ashford lay slumped over his desk, his face contorted in a grimace of pain, a glass of wine spilled across the papers before him. Poirot knelt beside him, checking for a pulse, but his fingers found only stillness. The Lord of Ashford Manor was dead. The guests crowded at the door, their gasps and murmurs filling the room. Lady Eleanor clutched Dr. Marlowe's arm, her face pale. Charles swore under his breath, his eyes darting to the window. Clara stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly, while Vernon pushed forward, demanding to know what had happened. Poirot rose, his expression grave but composed. "Madame et messieurs," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "Lord Ashford has been murdered. The door was locked from the inside, yet the killer is among us. I, Hercule Poirot, will find them." He turned to the desk, his eyes scanning the scene, the spilled wine, a strange burn mark on the wood, an open window with no signs of disturbance outside. The puzzle was complex, the stakes high, but Poirot's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of motive, opportunity, and deception. As the guests were ushered back to the drawing room, Poirot lingered, his gaze fixed on the burn mark. It was an anomaly, a clue that did not fit. And in that moment, he knew. The key to the mystery lay not in what was present, but in what was hidden. The game, as he often called it, had begun. Chapter 2. A Shocking Death. The grand dining hall of Ashford Manor shimmered under the glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers, their light refracting into tiny rainbows that danced across the polished mahogany table. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted pheasant, truffle-infused mashed potatoes, and a faint undercurrent of tension that Hercule Poirot could not ignore. He sat at the far end of the table, his small, precise hands folded neatly in his lap, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the guests. Lord Reginald Ashford, the host, presided at the head of the table, his silver hair gleaming, his voice booming, with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. Yet Poirot noted there was a brittleness to his laughter, a flicker of unease in his eyes as he raised his glass for a toast. To good company, good wine, and good fortune, Lord Ashford declared, his voice carrying over the clink of crystal. The guests then in total, a carefully curated mix of family, friends, and business associates, echoed the toast with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Poirot sipped his wine, a fine Bordeaux, and observed, Lady Eleanor Ashford, seated to her husband's right, smiled tightly, her delicate fingers clutching her glass a fraction too tightly. Charles Ashford, the nephew, lounged with a practised nonchalance, but his eyes darted toward his uncle with a hunger Poirot recognized all too well. Dr. Simon Marlowe, the family friend and physician, nodded politely, though his gaze lingered on Lady Eleanor a moment longer than propriety allowed. Miss Clara Beaumont, Lord Ashford's young secretary, sat primly, her eyes downcast, her fork moving with mechanical precision, and Mr. Harold Vernon, the rival businessman, wore a smile that never reached his eyes, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the tablecloth. The dinner proceeded with the usual formalities, small talk about the weather, the state of the London stock market, and the upcoming hunting season. Poirot, ever the observer, noted a barbed comment from Charles about the family estate's future drew a sharp glance from Lady Eleanor. Vernon's mention of a recent business deal elicited a forced chuckle from Lord Ashford, and Miss Clara, when asked about her work, offered a vague response that seemed to satisfy no one. Poirot's moustache twitched. There was, as he would say, a certain disorder in the air, as the main course gave way to dessert decadent. Chocolate soufflé. Lord Ashford excused himself. A brief matter to attend to in my study, he announced, rising with a slight wobble. I shall return shortly for coffee and cigars. His smile was gracious, but Poirot caught the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cufflinks. The host departed, leaving the guests to their dessert and their murmured conversations. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, but his mind was a whirl of activity. He had received the invitation to this dinner only 2 days prior, delivered by a courier with an air of urgency. The letter, penned in Lord Ashford's precise hand, had been cryptic. Your presence is requested at Ashford Manor for an evening. Of utmost importance. Discretion is paramount. Poirot had accepted, intrigued by the vagueness and the reputation of the Ashford family. Now, seated among these strangers, he sensed that the evening's true purpose had yet to reveal itself. The minutes ticked by, marked by the slow chime of the grandfather clock in the corner of the dining hall. The guests continued their conversations, though Poirot noted a growing unease. Lady Eleanor glanced toward the door through which her husband had exited. Charles refilled his wineglass with a touch too much enthusiasm. Dr. Marlowe excused himself to check his pocket watch, muttering about the lateness of the hour. Miss Clara, meanwhile, had barely touched her soufflé, her fingers twisting a napkin into knots. It was precisely 27 minutes after Lord Ashford's departure. Poirot had noted the time on his own pocket watch when a piercing scream shattered the room's fragile calm. The sound came from the direction of the study, a high, keening wail that sent a chill down Poirot's spine. The guests froze, their faces a tableau of shock and fear. Lady Eleanor was the first to move, leaping from her chair and rushing toward the hallway, her silk gown trailing behind her like a ghost. The others followed, Poirot among them, his short legs moving with surprising speed. The study was at the end of a long, oak-panelled corridor, its heavy door closed. Lady Eleanor pounded on it, her voice trembling. Reginald, opened the door. There was no response. Dr. Marlowe stepped forward, his medical instincts taking over, and tried. The handle, it was locked. "Stand back," Charles said, his voice sharp with authority. He threw his shoulder against the door, once, twice, until the lock gave way with a splintering crack. The door swung open, revealing a scene that would haunt the guests for years to come. Lord Reginald Ashford lay slumped over his desk, his face ashen, his eyes wide and unseeing. A glass of wine sat before him, half empty, its contents glinting in the lamplight. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a faint, acrid smell hung in the air, mingling with the scent of leather and old books. Poirot stepped forward, his eyes taking in every detail, the locked door, the open window with its curtains fluttering in the night breeze, the strange burn mark on the edge of the desk, like a scorch from a careless cigarette. "He's dead," Dr. Marlowe said, his voice flat as he pressed 2 fingers to Lord Ashford's neck. No pulse, no respiration. He leaned closer, sniffing the air near the glass. "Poison, I'd wager." Something stacking Lady Eleanor let out. A choked sob, collapsing into a chair. Charles stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. Miss Clara hovered near the doorway, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting between the body and the other guests. Vernon, meanwhile, had retreated to a corner, his expression unreadable. Poirot took charge with the calm authority that had made him legendary. "Mies, Amos, we must not touch anything," he said, his French accent precise, his tone commanding. "This is a crime scene, and we must preserve it for the police. But first, we must establish what has happened here." He turned to Dr. Marlowe. "You are certain of poison, Doctor?" Marlowe nodded, his face grim. "The symptoms are unmistakable dilated pupils, cyanosis around the lips, the suddenness of it, likely a cyanide compound, though I'd need a lab to confirm." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and the door was locked from the inside, was it not? Yet no one saw anyone enter or leave, a most curious puzzle. He glanced at the open window, noting the absence of footprints in the soft earth outside. The manor's grounds were surrounded by high walls, and the study was on the 2nd floor. An intruder from outside seemed unlikely. The guests began to speak all at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and suspicion. "Who could have done this?" Lady Eleanor whispered, her hands trembling. "Perhaps he took his own life," Vernon suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "Uncle Reginald, never." Charles snapped, his fists clenched. He was too stubborn for that. Miss Clara said nothing, but Poirot caught the fleeting look of panic in her eyes before she averted her gaze. "Silence, please," Poirot said, raising a hand. "We must proceed methodically. First, we will secure the room. Then we will speak, one by one, to understand where each of you was when this tragedy occurred." He turned to the butler, who had appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Monsieur, summon the police at once, and ensure no one leaves the manor." The butler nodded and hurried away. Poirot's gaze swept over the guests, noting their reactions. Lady Eleanor was weeping softly, her face buried in a handkerchief. Charles paced like a caged animal, his jaw tight. Dr. Marlowe busied himself, examining the body, though Poirot suspected it was more to keep his hands occupied than out of necessity. Miss Clara stood rigid, her eyes fixed on the floor, and Vernon, still in his corner, watched the scene with the detachment of a man who had seen worse. Poirot approached the desk, careful not to disturb anything. The glass of wine caught his attention. It was identical to those served at dinner, but the liquid inside had a faint, unnatural sheen. He leaned closer, his nose twitching at the acrid smell. Cyanide, perhaps, he murmured, but delivered how? And by whom? He turned his attention to the burn mark on the desk. It was small, no larger than a shilling, but oddly precise, as if something had been deliberately placed there. He ran a finger near it, not touching, never touching, and noted. The faint residue of ash curio, he said softly. Very curious. The open window was another puzzle. The night was cool, the breeze gentle. Yet there were no signs of disturbance outside, no broken branches, no footprints, no ladder marks. Against the sill. If someone had entered or exited this way, they had done so with supernatural grace. Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the scene. A locked room, a poisoned glass, a burn mark, an open window, and a house full of suspects, each with their own secrets. He glanced at the guests, who were now watching him with a mix of awe and apprehension. They knew his reputation, his uncanny ability to unravel the impossible, and Poirot, for his part, felt the familiar thrill of the chase. "Madame et messieurs," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "we are faced with a crime most diabolical. But fear not, Hercule Poirot does not rest until the truth is revealed. We will begin with your accounts of the evening. Where were you, each of you, when Lord Ashford left the dining room?" The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Poirot noted every flicker of expression, every shift in posture. Lady Eleanor spoke first, her voice trembling. "I was in the dining room. Of course, we all were. I didn't leave my seat until the scream." "And who screamed?" Poirot asked, his eyes sharp. I think it was one of the maids," Lady Eleanor said. "I didn't see her, but it came from the hallway." Poirot nodded, filing the information away. "And you, Monsieur Charles?" Charles stopped pacing, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I was at the table, same as everyone else. I didn't even notice Uncle Reginald was gone for so long until we heard the scream." Poirot's gaze moved to Dr. Marlowe, who was wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "And you, Doctor?" "I stepped out briefly to check my watch." Marlowe said, "I was in the hallway, near the staircase. I didn't go near the study." Poirot's moustache twitched. "And yet you were quick to reach the door, were you not?" Marlowe flushed. "I'm a doctor. When I heard the scream, I acted on instinct." "Been," Poirot said, turning to Miss Clara. "And you, mademoiselle?" Clara's voice was soft, almost inaudible. "I was in the dining room. I didn't leave." Poirot noted the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes avoided his. "And Monsieur?" Vernon shrugged, his smile thin. "I stayed at the table, enjoying the wine. I had no reason to wander off." Poirot nodded, his mind cataloguing their words, their tones, their gestures. Already he sensed inconsistencies, though they were too vague to pinpoint. The police would arrive soon, and with them the chaos of an official investigation. But Poirot knew that the truth lay not in fingerprints or forensics, but in the human heart, its desires, its fears, its lies. As the guests dispersed to wait in the drawing-room, Poirot remained in the study, his eyes lingering on the body of Lord Ashford. The man had been larger than life, a titan of industry, yet here he lay, reduced to a puzzle to be solved. Poirot's fingers brushed the edge of his moustache, a habit when deep in thought. "Who are you, mon ami?" he murmured to the corpse. "And who wished you dead?" The room offered no answers, but Poirot was undeterred. He would question, he would observe, he would unravel, and somewhere in this house, among these polished surfaces and hidden motives, the truth awaited. The police arrived. Within the hour, their heavy boots echoing through the manor's halls. Inspector Grayson, a stout man with a walrus moustache and a no-nonsense demeanour, took charge of the scene. He listened as Poirot outlined the situation, his expression sceptical but respectful. "You're that detective, aren't you, Grayson?" said, eyeing Poirot's impeccable suit and polished shoes. "The one who solves the unsolvable." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "I am Hercule Poirot, and I assist where I am needed. This case, Inspector, is one of great complexity. A locked room, a poison, and a house full of secrets." Grayson grunted. "We'll see about that. My men will dust for prints and bag the evidence. You're welcome to poke around, but don't get in our way." Poirot smiled faintly. "I assure you, Inspector, I work best in the shadows." As the police began their work, Poirot retreated to a corner of the study, his eyes scanning the room once more. The glass of wine, the burn mark, the open window, they were pieces of a puzzle, but not the whole picture. The true key, he knew, lay in the guests themselves. Their alibis, their motives, their lies. He would speak to them again, probe deeper, and watch for the telltale signs of guilt. The night stretched on, the manor alive with the hum of investigation. The guests were sequestered in the drawing-room, their voices low and tense. Poirot moved. Among them, a silent observer, noting the way Lady Eleanor clutched her handkerchief, the way Charles's eyes darted toward the door, the way Dr. Marlowe's hands trembled ever so slightly. Miss Clara sat alone, her face pale, her fingers still twisting that napkin, and Vernon, ever the outsider, watched it all with a detachment that Poirot found both intriguing and suspicious. By midnight, the police had sealed the study and taken statements from the guests. Inspector Grayson approached Poirot, his notebook in hand. "They all claimed they were in the dining room when it happened," he said. "No one saw anything, no one heard anything until the scream. Sounds like a load of bunk to me." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "It is often the case, Inspector, that those who claim to see nothing see the most. We must look beyond their words, to the little things, the gestures, the glances, the silences." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "You think one of them did it?" "I think," Poirot said, his voice soft but firm, "that someone in this house knows more than they say, and I, Hercule Poirot, will find them." The inspector grunted again, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to argue with a man of Poirot's reputation. As he turned to confer with his men, Poirot's gaze returned to the guests. They were a tapestry of secrets, woven together by greed, jealousy, and perhaps something darker. He would unravel that tapestry, thread by thread, until the truth was laid bare. For the next several hours, Poirot moved through the manor, observing, questioning, listening. He spoke to the maids, who confirmed the scream had come from one of their own, a young girl named Elsie, who had been passing the study, on her way to fetch more wine. Elsie, trembling and tearful, swore she had seen no one enter or leave the study. but Poirot noted the way her eyes flickered when he pressed her about the guest's movements earlier in the evening. He spoke to the butler, Mr. Jenkins, a stoic man with a face like weathered oak. Jenkins confirmed that the study's door had been locked when he last checked it before dinner, and that only Lord Ashford and Miss Clara had keys. This piqued Poirot's interest. Why would a secretary have a key to such a private room? He examined the study again, this time with the police's permission. The burn mark on the desk fascinated him. It was not the result of a cigarette or a candle, too precise, too chemical. He scraped a tiny sample of the residue into a handkerchief, intending to have it analyzed later. The wineglass, too, was taken by the police for testing, but had no doubt it would confirm cyanide or a similar poison. The open window continued to puzzle him. The manor's grounds were well maintained, the earth soft from recent rain, yet there were no signs of disturbance. If someone had climbed in or out, they had done so with extraordinary care, or perhaps, Poirot thought, the window was a distraction, meant to mislead. As dawn approached, the guests were allowed to retire to their rooms, though under strict orders not to leave the manor. Poirot, tireless despite the late hour, sat in the drawing-room, a cup of tea in hand, his mind working furiously. The locked room, the poison, the burn mark, the window, they were all pieces of a larger picture, one that he was beginning to glimpse. He thought of the guests, their faces, their words. Lady Eleanor's grief seemed genuine, but was it too perfect, too practiced? Charles's ambition was clear, but did it extend to murder? Dr. Marlowe's knowledge of poisons was suspicious, but his calm demeanor suggested confidence or innocence. Miss Clara's nervousness was telling, but was it guilt or fear? And Vernon, with his cool detachment, seemed almost too uninvolved, as if he were playing a part. Poirot sipped his tea, his eyes narrowing. The key, he knew, was not in the physical evidence alone, but in the psychology of the crime. Someone in this house had planned this murder with care, constructing a puzzle to baffle even the great Hercule Poirot, but they had not counted on his greatest weapon, his ability to see through the lies, to read the human soul. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the drawing-room's windows, Poirot set down his cup and rose. The game was afoot, and he would not rest until he had caught the liar who thought they could outwit him. The truth, he knew, was close, so close he could almost taste it. Chapter 3. The initial suspects. The air in Ashford Manor grew heavier as the reality of Lord Reginald Ashford's death settled over the guests like a suffocating fog. The grand dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany table, now felt like a stage where every gesture and glance carried hidden meaning. Hercule Poirot, his small frame exuding quiet authority, stood near the fireplace, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of those gathered. The guests, still reeling from the discovery of Lord Ashford's body, were seated in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from tearful shock to guarded unease. The local constable, a nervous young man named Jenkins, stood awkwardly by the door, clearly out of his depth. Poirot had taken charge, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos of emotions swirling around him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice precise and accented, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "We are faced with a tragedy most grave. Lord Ashford has been taken from us, not by accident, but by poisoner, deliberate act. It is my intention to uncover the truth, and I shall require your cooperation. Each of you will be questioned, for each of you was present this evening, and none may leave until we have clarity A ripple of unease passed through the room. Lady Eleanor Ashford, the late lord's wife, sat at the far end of the semicircle, her delicate hands clutching a lace handkerchief. Her face, pale and drawn, bore the marks of grief, but her eyes darted nervously toward the others, betraying a deeper anxiety. Beside her, Charles Ashford, the nephew and heir apparent, slouched in his chair, his handsome features twisted into a mask of sorrow that seemed almost too perfect. Dr. Harold Marlowe, the family physician and longtime friend, sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his jaw tight. Miss Clara Wentworth, Lord Ashford's private secretary, perched on the edge of her seat, her posture rigid, her fingers twisting the hem of her skirt. And Mr. Leonard Vernon, the rival businessman whose dealings with Ashford had been contentious, leaned back with a faint smirk, as if daring anyone to accuse him. Poirot began his interviews methodically, moving from one suspect to the next, his questions deceptively simple but designed to probe beneath the surface. He started with Lady Eleanor, whose status as the widow made her both a figure of sympathy and suspicion. Madame Ashford, Poirot said, his tone gentle but firm, you were seated beside your husband during the dinner. Did you observe anything unusual in his demeanour or in the behaviour of those around him? Lady Eleanor's lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Reginald seemed preoccupied. He was quieter than usual, but I thought it was the strain of hosting. He had been so busy with his business affairs lately, and he mentioned feeling tired. She paused, dabbing her eyes with the handkerchief. I didn't notice anything specific, Monsieur Poirot. It was a normal dinner, or so I thought. Poirot tilted his head, his moustache twitching slightly as he considered her words. And yet, madame, a man does not die of poison during a normal dinner. Tell me, did anyone approach your husband's glass of wine? Did you see anyone linger near his place at the table? Her eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. No, no one. The servants poured the wine, and we were all seated. I was speaking to Dr. Marlowe about a charity event, and I wasn't paying close attention. Her voice faltered, and she looked down, her fingers tightening round the handkerchief. Poirot noted the tremor in her hands, the way her gaze flickered toward Dr. Marlowe before returning to her lap. He made no comment, but moved on to Charles, who straightened in his chair as if preparing for a performance. Monsieur Charles, Poirot said, his eyes narrowing slightly, you are the nephew of Lord Ashford, and, perhaps, the one who stands to gain the most from his passing. Tell me about your relationship with your uncle. Charles's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile, his voice smooth and practiced. Uncle Reginald was like a father to me. He took me in after my parents died, gave me a home, an education, everything. I loved him dearly. He paused, his eyes glistening with what appeared to be tears. I can't believe anyone would do this to him. He was a good man, even if he could be. Strict at times, strict you say. Poirot's tone was mild, but his gaze was piercing. In what way was he strict, monsieur? Charles hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. He had high expectations. He wanted me to take over the family business, but I have my own ambitions. We argued sometimes, but it was nothing serious. Just family matters. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And yet, family matters can sometimes lead to great passions. Nan, where were you during the dinner, and did you notice anything unusual about your uncle's wine or his behaviour? I was seated across from him, Charles said quickly. I didn't see anything odd. He drank his wine, same as the rest of us. I was talking to Miss Wentworth about some estate paperwork, so I wasn't watching him every moment." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. But he made a mental note of Charles's rehearsed tone, the way his grief seemed to come and go like a stage actor's performance. He turned next to Dr. Marlowe, whose medical expertise made him a figure of particular interest. "Dr. Poirot said, as a physician, you are familiar with poisons, are you not? What can you tell me about the symptoms Lord Ashford displayed before his death?" Dr. Marlowe's face remained impassive, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Lady Eleanor before he answered. "I wasn't in the room when he collapsed, monsieur. Poirot, I was called to the study after the fact. Based on what I saw, his pallor, the rigidity of his limbs, the froth at his mouth, I'd say it was a fast-acting poison, possibly strychnine or something similar. But I'd need to examine the body further to be certain." Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "And yet, you did not examine the body further, doctor. You did not think to investigate the cause immediately, given your expertise." Jaw tightened again. "I was in shock, like everyone else, and I'm not a coroner, Monsieur Poirot. My role was to comfort Lady Eleanor and ensure the other guests didn't panic." "Very noble," Poirot said, his tone carrying a hint of irony. "And during the dinner, where were you seated, and what did you observe?" "I was next to Lady Eleanor," Marlowe replied. "We were discussing a local hospital fundraiser. I didn't notice anything unusual about Reginald's behavior, though he did seem distracted, as Eleanor mentioned." Poirot's eyes lingered on Marlowe, noting the man's calm exterior and the slight tension in his posture. He moved on to Miss Clara Wentworth, whose prim demeanour and sharp eyes suggested a mind accustomed to detail. "Mademoiselle Wentworth," Poirot said, as Lord Ashford's secretary, "you were privy to his private affairs. Tell me, what was his state of mind in the days leading up to this tragedy?" Clara's lips pursed slightly, and she smoothed her skirt before answering. Lord Ashford was under considerable stress. He was negotiating a major business deal with Mr. Vernon, and there were complications. He was also reviewing his will, which caused some tension with certain family members. She glanced briefly at Charles, then back at Poirot, but he was in good spirits at the dinner, or so it seemed. "And your movements during the evening?" Poirot pressed. "Did you have occasion to leave the dining room or approach Lord Ashford's wine?" Clara's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained steady. "I was seated near Charles, as he mentioned. I didn't leave the table until after dessert, when I went to fetch some papers from the study at Lord Ashford's request. That was before he was found." Poirot's moustache twitched again. "And these papers, mademoiselle, what were they?" "Just routine correspondence," Clara said quickly. "Nothing significant." Poirot made no comment, but filed away her response, noting the slight flush in her cheeks. Finally, he turned to Mr. Vernon, whose smirk had faded under the weight of Poirot's scrutiny. "Monsieur Vernon," Poirot said, "your business dealings with Lord Ashford were, shall we say, less than amicable. Tell me about this deal that caused such complications as Mademoiselle Wentworth described." Vernon leaned forward, his voice gruff but controlled. "Reginald and I were negotiating a merger. He wanted control, I wanted a fair split. We didn't see eye to eye, but that's business, not murder. I was at the dinner table the whole time, and I didn't touch his damn wine." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And yet, monsieur, a man does not die of poison without someone placing it in his glass. You had motive, perhaps, to eliminate a rival." Vernon's face reddened. "That's absurd. I'd gain nothing from his death. The deal was still on the table, and killing him would only complicate things. Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the group. Very well. Each of you has provided an account, and yet the truth remains elusive. I shall continue my inquiries, and I advise you all to remain vigilant. The murderer is among us, and they will not escape the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot. As the guests dispersed, Poirot lingered by the fireplace, his mind racing. Lady Eleanor's nervousness, Charles's theatrical grief, Marlowe's guarded demeanour, Clara's evasive answers, and Vernon's defensiveness were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. He knew that alibis could be fabricated, motives concealed, and appearances deceptive. The key, he sensed, lay not just in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. Over the next few hours, Poirot conducted more detailed interviews, probing deeper into each suspect's background and relationship. With Lord Ashford, Lady Eleanor revealed that her marriage had been strained in recent years, with Ashford's obsession with his business empire leaving little room for affection. She admitted to feeling isolated, though she insisted she had no hand in his death. Charles, when pressed, confessed to a recent argument with his uncle over money. Ashford had threatened to cut him out of the will if he didn't shape up. Dr. Marlowe admitted to prescribing Ashford a mild sedative for stress, but denied any knowledge of poisons in the manner. Clara revealed that she had been working late in the study the previous night, organizing Ashford's papers, but she maintained that nothing was amiss. Vernon, meanwhile, grudgingly admitted that the failed merger had cost him a significant sum, though he insisted he had moved on to other ventures. Poirot also spoke with the servants, who confirmed that the wine had been poured from a single decanter, handled only by the butler, Mr. Grayson, who swore he had no opportunity to tamper with it. The kitchen staff reported that the food was prepared under strict supervision, and no one had access to the study after Ashford retired there following dessert. The locked room remained a mystery, its secrets guarded by the absence of footprints, and the peculiar burn mark on the desk. As the night wore on, Poirot retreated to a quiet corner of the Manor's library, his notebook open before him. He sketched a diagram of the dining table, marking each guest's position, and jotted down their statements, circling inconsistencies. Lady Eleanor's nervous glances toward Marlowe suggested a connection beyond friendship. Charles's grief felt too polished, as if rehearsed for an audience. Marlowe's knowledge of poisons was troubling, though his calm demeanour suggested confidence in his innocence or arrogance in his guilt. Clara's access to the study and her vague answers about the papers raised red flags, and Vernon's temper, while genuine, could mask a deeper resentment. Poirot closed his notebook and leaned back, his eyes half closed. The alibis were airtight, the motives murky, and the method baffling. Yet he knew that the truth lay in the details, the flicker of an eyelid, the pause before an answer, the subtle shift in posture. He would observe, he would question, and he would wait. The murderer, he was certain, would betray themselves in time. For nearly 10,000 words, Poirot's investigation unfolded with meticulous care. He revisited each suspect multiple times, testing their stories, planting subtle doubts, and watching for cracks in their facades. He questioned Lady Eleanor about her husband's recent changes to his will, noting her discomfort when he mentioned a mysterious charity. He pressed Charles on his financial troubles, learning of gambling debts that Ashford had refused to cover. He challenged Marlowe on his proximity to Lady Eleanor, eliciting a flush of anger that hinted at unspoken feelings. He probed Clara's knowledge of Ashford's business dealings, uncovering her familiarity with the Manor's hidden passages, knowledge she had not disclosed, and he confronted Vernon about a heated exchange overheard by a servant, forcing him to admit to threatening Ashford days before the dinner. Through it all, Poirot's mind worked like a finely tuned machine, cataloguing every word, every gesture, every contradiction. He sketched timelines, cross-referenced statements, and pondered the locked room's secrets. The burn mark nagged at him, a clue that seemed insignificant to others, but screamed of intent to him. He requested samples of the wine, the glass, and the desk's surface, sending them to a local chemist for analysis, though he suspected the answer lay not in science but in human nature. By the time the chapter drew to a close, Poirot had built a mental map of the suspect's motives and opportunities, but the puzzle remained incomplete. He knew the killer was clever, their plan designed to deflect suspicion. Yet he also knew that no plan was perfect, and no liar could withstand the scrutiny of Hercule Poirot. As he retired to his room for the night, he murmured to himself, "The little grey cells, they are at work. The truth, it will reveal itself. It always does." Chapter 4. The Locked Room. Puzzled Hercule Poirot stood in the dimly lit study of Lord Reginald Ashford, his sharp eyes scanning every detail of the room where the tragedy had unfolded. The heavy oak door, now ajar, had been locked from the inside. When the body was discovered, a fact that intrigued him immensely, the air carried a faint metallic temps, mingling with the musty scent of old books lining the shelves. A single window, slightly open, let in a cool breeze that rustled the curtains, but the ground outside showed no signs of disturbance. No trampled grass. The scene was a puzzle, and Poirot relished puzzles. The study was a grand, imposing space, befitting a man of Lord Ashford's stature. A massive mahogany desk dominated the centre, its surface cluttered with papers, a quill pen, and a half-empty glass of red wine that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Poirot's gaze lingered on the glass, its contents undisturbed except for the slight ripple caused by the breeze. Beside it, a peculiar burn mark marred the polished wood, a small, irregular patch, no larger than a shilling, with a faint chemical odour. He leaned closer, his moustache twitching as he inhaled deeply, committing the scent to memory. "Curieux," he murmured, straightening up. "A burn, but not from a cigarette or a candle. Nan, this is something else entirely." He turned his attention to the room's other features. The walls were adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. A large fireplace, cold and unused, sat against one wall, its mantel adorned with a silver candelabra and a small clock that had stopped at 9:47, roughly the time Lord Ashford had been discovered. The rug beneath his feet was Persian, its intricate patterns slightly worn but still vibrant. Poirot noted a faint scuff mark near the desk, as if something had been dragged or shifted. The locked door was the crux of the mystery. According to the butler, Mr. Jenkins, the door had been bolted from the inside, and the key was still in the lock when the guests forced their way in after hearing Lady Eleanor's scream. Poirot examined the lock closely, running his fingers along the smooth brass. It was a sturdy mechanism, not easily tampered with. The key, still in place, showed no signs of damage or forced entry. He tested the bolt, sliding it back and forth with a satisfying click. "Impossible, they say," Poirot mused, a faint smile playing on his lips. But to Hercule Poirot, nothing is impossible. The truth, it hides in the details. He crossed to the window, pushing it open wider to peer outside. The manor's grounds stretched into the darkness, the lawn pristine under the moonlight. The drop from the window to the ground was a good 10 feet, and the soil below was soft, yet undisturbed. No ladder marks, no footprints, no signs of anyone climbing in or out. He closed the window and latched it, noting that the latch was loose but functional. A faint draught seeped through, suggesting the window had been open for some time before the murder. Poirot returned to the desk, his mind racing. The half-empty glass of wine was a focal point. He lifted it carefully, holding it to the light. The liquid was clear, with no visible sediment, but the faint chemical scent from the burn mark lingered in his mind. Poison, he suspected, was the method of choice, but how had it been administered? The glass had been untouched since the body was found, and the coroner's initial report confirmed a fast-acting toxin, though the exact type was still under analysis. He set the glass down and examined the burn mark again. It was irregular, with a slight sheen, as if a liquid had reacted with the wood's varnish. He scraped a small sample with his pocketknife, folding it into a handkerchief for later analysis. "This mark," he said softly, "it is a clue. Perhaps the clue, but what does it tell us?" Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Inspector Grayson, the local police officer assigned to the case, entered, his face etched with frustration. "Monsieur," he said, tipping his hat. "Any progress? The guests are getting restless, and the press is sniffing around. A locked room murder at Ashford Manor. This is going to be a sensation." Poirot waved a hand dismissively. "The press, they are vultures. Inspector, let them squawk. As for progress, I have only begun. This room, it speaks to me, but its language is subtle. Tell me, what do you make of the lock?" Grayson frowned, stepping closer to the door. Solid as a bank vault. No signs of tampering. The butler swears it was locked when they broke in, and the key was still in the lock. I've seen my share of locked room cases, but this one's a devil. No secret passages, no hidden doors at least, none we've found. Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming. And yet, someone entered this room, or the poison entered without them. The wine, the burn mark, the open window, these are pieces of a puzzle. We must fit them together. Grayson scratched his head. The wine's being tested, but the coroner thinks it's the likely source. Problem is, everyone was drinking. The same vintage at dinner, and no one else is ill. If it was poisoned, it had to be targeted. Precisement, Poirot said, tapping his temple. Targeted, meticulous, and clever. This is no crime of passion, Inspector. This is a performance. Stage 2 perplex us. He began to pace, his polished shoes clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Let us consider the sequence of events. Lord Ashford excuses himself from dinner at approximately 9:30, saying he has urgent business to attend to. He comes to this study, locks the door, and within 20 minutes he is dead. The guests hear Lady Eleanor's scream at 9:50, and they break in to find him slumped at his desk, the wine glass beside him, the window open, and this curious burn mark. Grayson nodded. That's the timeline, as far as we know. The guests all swear they were together in the dining room, except for Miss Clara, who stepped out briefly to fetch a shawl, and Mr. Vernon, who used the washroom. Both were gone for only a few minutes, not long enough to sneak in here, poison the wine, and get out, especially with the door locked. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, the impossible has occurred. We must question what we assume to be true, the alibis, the locked door, the absence of footprints. These are not facts, Inspector, but observations. And observations can be manipulated. He moved to the fireplace, running his hand along the mantel. The clock, stopped at 9:47, caught his attention again. He lifted it, inspecting the mechanism. Stopped, but not broken, he said. Perhaps it was stopped deliberately to mislead us about the time of death. Or perhaps it simply ran down. We must verify. Grayson made a note. I'll have the clock examined. Anything else? Poirot gestured to the room at large. Everything, Inspector. Every detail matters. The scuff mark on the rug, the position of the papers on the desk, the angle of the quill pen. This room is a stage, and the murderer has left their script hidden in plain sight. Over the next hour, Poirot continued his meticulous examination. He measured the distance from the desk to the window, noting that it was too far for someone to have reached in from outside without leaving marks. He inspected the papers on the desk, mostly business correspondence. But one sheet caught his eye, a handwritten note, partially torn, with the words charity and fraud scrawled. In Ashford's distinctive script. He tucked it into his pocket, deciding to keep it from Grayson for now. The shelves yielded little of interest, though Poirot noted a gap where a book seemed to be missing. He ran his finger along the shelf, finding a thin layer of dust disturbed. In one spot, as if something had been recently removed. Another piece of the puzzle, he said, his voice barely audible. As he worked, his mind churned through possibilities. The locked door suggested the killer had access to a key or another means of entry. The open window, while tempting, seemed a red herring, too obvious, too impractical. The burn mark, however, was unique. It suggested a chemical, perhaps the poison itself, spilled accidentally during the act. But how had the poison reached the glass? And why was the room locked? Poirot paused, closing his eyes to visualize the scene. He imagined Lord Ashford entering the study, locking the door behind him, pouring a glass of wine from a decanter on the sideboard. The poison could have been in the decanter, but that risked others drinking from it. No, it was more likely added directly to the glass, perhaps during a moment when Ashford was distracted, but by whom and how? He opened his eyes, his gaze falling on the sideboard. The decanter sat there, half full, alongside a tray of crystal glasses. He lifted the decanter, swirling the liquid inside. It looked identical to the wine in the glass on the desk, but he would wait for the coroner's report to confirm. For now, he noted the decanter's stopper, which was slightly askew, as if it had been hastily replaced. Inspector Poirot called, beckoning Grayson over. "This decanter, has it been tested?" "Not yet," Grayson admitted. "We focused on the glass first. I'll have it sent to the lab." "Do so," Poirot said, "and ensure the stopper is examined." A small detail, but significant. As Grayson made another note, Poirot's thoughts turned to the suspects. Each had been in the dining room, yet each had a motive. Lady Eleanor, trapped in a loveless marriage, stood to inherit a fortune. Charles, the ambitious nephew, had expectations of wealth that might have been dashed. Dr. Marlowe, with his medical knowledge, could have access to rare poisons. Miss Clara, the quiet secretary, knew Ashford's secrets. And Mr. Vernon, the rival, had a history of bad blood. The alibis, while seemingly airtight, were based on the word of people with much to hide. Poirot's mind returned to the burn mark. He knelt beside the desk, studying it from a different angle. The mark was not uniform, it had a slight curve, as if the liquid had been poured or dripped. He pictured the killer standing over the desk, perhaps adding the poison to the glass, a drop spilling in their haste. The chemical nature of the mark suggested a substance not commonly found in a study, something scientific, precise. He stood, brushing his hands together. This murder, he said to Grayson, is not merely a crime. It is a performance designed to confuse and mislead. The locked door, the open window, the burn mark, these are props, carefully placed to distract us from the truth. But Hercule Poirot is not so easily distracted. Grayson raised an eyebrow. You think the killer's still in the house? Poirot smiled faintly. Oh, yes, Inspector. They are here, watching, waiting. They believe they have crafted the perfect crime. But perfection is an illusion, and illusions can be shattered. He spent the next hour cataloguing every detail of the room, sketching a mental map of its contents. The scuff mark on the rug suggested movement. Perhaps a chair shifted slightly during the act. The papers on the desk, while mostly mundane, included that cryptic note about a charity and fraud, potentially a motive for someone desperate to keep a secret. The stopped clock, the loose window latch, the disturbed dust on the shelf all were threads in a tapestry. Poirot was determined to unravel as he worked. He began to form a hypothesis. The locked room was not a barrier but a statement. The killer wanted it to seem impossible, to deflect suspicion. The poison, likely administered through the wine, required access to the study, either before or during Ashford's brief time there. The burn mark suggested a mistake, a moment of carelessness that could betray the culprit, and the open window, while tempting, was likely a distraction, a way to make the police look outside when the truth lay within. Poirot stepped back, surveying the room one last time. The study was silent now, save for the faint ticking of a distant clock in the hall. He closed his eyes, letting the details swirl in his mind. The wine, the burn mark, the locked door, the stopped clockage was a clue, a whisper of the truth. He would need to speak to the suspects again, to observe their reactions, to test their stories. But for now, the room had given him what he needed, a starting point. Inspector, he said, turning to Grayson, seal this room. No one is to enter without my permission. The answers are here, and I will find them. Grayson nodded, clearly impressed by Poirot's intensity. You really think you can crack this one, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot's eyes twinkled. Think, Inspector. None, I do not think. I know. The little grey cells, they are already at work. This locked room will yield its secrets, and the liar will be unmasked. As they left the study, Poirot cast one final glance at the desk, the wine glass glinting in the lamplight. The puzzle was complex, but he was Hercule Poirot, and no puzzle was beyond his reach. The burn mark, the locked door, the open window, these were not obstacles, but invitations, and he was determined to accept them. The next morning, Poirot returned to the study, this time with a small magnifying glass and a notebook. He began by re-examining the burn mark, which had taken on new significance in his mind. The chemical odor suggested a substance not typically found in a household, a poison, perhaps, or a reagent used to mask it. He made a note to consult with the coroner about the exact nature of the toxin. Suspecting it might match the mark's properties, he moved to the window, inspecting the latch more closely. The looseness was not due to wear, but to a slight misalignment, as if it had been forced or tampered with. He filed this away, considering whether someone could have manipulated the latch from outside, though the absence of footprints remained a hurdle. The rug's scuff mark drew his attention next. He knelt, running his fingers over the fibers. The mark was faint, barely noticeable, but it suggested something heavy had been moved, a chair, perhaps, or a small table. He stood and tested the chair at the desk, sliding it back and forth. It moved smoothly, with no resistance, but the scuff mark was slightly to the side, as if something else had been shifted. Poirot's gaze fell on the sideboard again. The decanter and glasses were untouched since his last visit. But he noticed something new, a faint ring of condensation on the wood, as if a glass had been set down briefly. He measured it against the wine glass on the desk, finding it matched perfectly. "Interesting," he murmured. A second glass, perhaps, or the same one, moved and returned. He made a note to ask the butler about the sideboard's contents before the dinner. Had the decanter been tampered with? Had a glass been swapped? The possibilities multiplied, each one a thread to be followed. The stopped clock was his next. Focus. He opened its back, examining the mechanism. The spring was intact, but the hands had been manually set to 9:47, then stopped. This was deliberate. He realized a way to fix the time of death in the minds of the investigators. But why? To create an alibi, to confuse the timeline. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion outside. He stepped into the hall, where Lady Eleanor was arguing with Charles, her voice sharp with accusation. "You were always after his money, Charles. Don't pretend you're grieving." Charles's face reddened. "How dare you? I loved Uncle Reginald. You're the one who couldn't stand him." Poirot observed silently, noting their body language. Lady Eleanor's hands trembled, her eyes darting nervously. Charles, meanwhile, stood rigid, his jaw clenched, as if holding back a torrent of emotion. Their argument was revealing, not for what they said, but for what they didn't. He returned to the study, closing the door behind him. The room felt different now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. He sat at the desk, imagining Lord Ashford's final moments. Had he known he was drinking poison? Had he suspected betrayal? The half-empty glass suggested he had taken several sips, enough for the toxin to take effect. The absence of overturned furniture, no scattered papers, indicated a swift, silent death. Poirot leaned back, closing his eyes. The locked room was a challenge, but it was also a gift. The killer had overreached, creating a puzzle so complex it drew attention to itself. The burn mark, the stopped clock, the open window, these were not accidents, but choices. Each one a clue to the killer's mind. He opened his notebook, sketching a diagram of the room. He marked the desk, the window, the sideboard, and the scuff. Mark, connecting them with lines of possibility. The poison had entered the room somehow, and the killer had ensured the door was locked. A second key, a hidden entrance, or something simpler, more elegant. Poirot's mind turned to the suspects again. Miss Clara, with her quiet demeanour, had been in the manor all day, giving her ample opportunity to tamper with the wine or the room. Dr. Marlowe's medical expertise made him a candidate for sourcing a rare poison. Lady Eleanor's nervous demeanour suggested guilt, but perhaps it was merely grief for fear. Charles's ambition was clear, but his alibi was strong. And Vernon, with his business rivalry, had the motive but not the access. The burn mark remained the key. Poirot returned to it, kneeling to study it under the magnifying glass. The edges were slightly raised, as if the liquid had eaten into the varnish. He scraped another small sample, noting its texture. It was granular, almost crystalline, unlike a typical liquid spill. This was no ordinary chemical, it was specific, unique. He stood, his mind racing. The poison, the burn mark, the locked door, they were linked. But how? He needed more information, more data. The coroner's report would be critical, as would interviews with the staff. Someone had seen something, even if they didn't realize it. Poirot left the study, locking the door behind him. The manor was alive with tension, the guests whispering in corners, the staff moving silently through the halls. He felt their eyes. On him, their curiosity and fear. They knew he was hunting, and the killer, he was certain, was watching closely in the drawing room. He gathered the suspects, his demeanor calm but commanding. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice steady. "This crime is a puzzle, but it is not unsolvable. The locked room, the poison, the burn mark, these are clues, and they will lead us to the truth. I ask only that you remain patient and truthful. The liar among you will not escape Hercule Poirot." He watched their reactions carefully. Lady Eleanor's hands tightened on her handkerchief. Charles's jaw twitched. Dr. Marlowe's eyes narrowed slightly. Miss Clara stared at the floor, her face unreadable. Vernon shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. The game had begun, and Poirot's genius was in motion. The locked room would yield its secrets, and the liar would be caught not by force, but by the relentless logic of his little grey cells. Over the next few days, Poirot returned to the study repeatedly, each visit revealing new subtleties. He interviewed the butler, Mr. Jenkins, who confirmed that the decanter had been filled that afternoon by the housekeeper, Mrs. Bates. The glasses on the sideboard were clean, but one had been missing earlier in the day, only to reappear before dinner. This was significant. Had the killer used a second glass to deliver the poison, then swapped it back? He spoke to Mrs. Bates, who admitted to noticing a faint chemical smell in the pantry earlier that day, though she thought it was cleaning fluid. Poirot requested a sample of the pantry's contents, suspecting the poison might have been stored there temporarily. The coroner's preliminary report arrived, confirming a rare alkaloid poison, one not easily obtained. This pointed to someone with specialized knowledge, Dr. Marlowe, perhaps, or someone with access to his medical supplies. The burn mark, the coroner noted, could have been caused by a concentrated form of the same toxin, spilled accidentally. Poirot's hypothesis grew clearer. The killer had entered the study before dinner, perhaps during the afternoon, when the manor was quiet. They had tampered with the wine glass, adding the poison and leaving the burn mark in a moment of carelessness. The locked door was a ruse, achieved by locking it after the fact, possibly with a duplicate key or a trick of the latch. The open window was a distraction, meant to suggest an outside intruder. He tested this theory by examining the doorframe. Again, looking for signs of a second key or a forced lock. He found nothing definitive, but the possibility lingered. He also inspected the walls for hidden panels, tapping gently with a small mallet. The sound was solid throughout, ruling out a secret passage for now. The stopped clock bothered him. If it had been deliberately set to 9:47, it suggested the killer wanted to control the timeline. He checked the manor's other clocks, finding them all synchronized to within a minute. The study clock's discrepancy was intentional, but its purpose remained elusive. Poirot's interviews with the suspects continued, each one revealing more about their characters. Lady Eleanor's grief seemed genuine, but her nervous fidgeting suggested she was hiding something, perhaps not guilt, but fear. Charles's rehearsed sorrow was unconvincing, his ambition too obvious. Dr. Marlowe's calm demeanor was almost too perfect, as if he were guarding a secret. Miss Clara's quiet reserve was impenetrable, but her eyes darted nervously when Poirot mentioned the study. Vernon's agitation grew with each conversation, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. The burn mark remained the linchpin. Poirot consulted a local chemist, describing the mark's appearance and odor. The chemist suggested it could be the result of a concentrated alkaloid, possibly the same poison, reacting with the desk's varnish. This confirmed Poirot's suspicion. The killer had spilled the poison, leaving a trace of their crime. He returned to the study one final time, standing in the center of the room, letting the details wash over him. The locked door, the open window, the burn mark, the stopped clock, the wine glass, they formed a pattern, a narrative. The killer had planned meticulously, but no plan was perfect. The burn mark was their mistake, the flaw in their performance. Poirot smiled, his confidence growing. "You are clever, mon ami," he said to the absent killer, "but you are not Hercule Poirot. Your secret is mine to uncover, and I am very close." He left the study, his notebook filled with sketches and observations. The locked room was no longer a mystery but a challenge, and he was ready to meet it. The next step was to test the suspects, to push them until the liar revealed themselves. The burn mark had given him the key. Now he would use it to unlock the truth. Poirot's pulse quickened. Fraught. The word pointed to a motive far more sinister than personal grudges. He needed to speak to Clara again, but discreetly. She had been in the study, and she had access to Ashford's correspondence. If anyone knew about this fraud, it was her. He found her in the conservatory, arranging flowers with a precision that bordered on obsession. The glass-walled room was humid, filled with the scent of roses and damp earth. Clara looked up as Poirot approached, her expression guarded. "Mademoiselle Winston," Poirot said, his tone light, "you are most diligent in your duties, even in a time of grief. Tell me, did Lord Ashford ever speak to you of a fraud within his company?" Clara's hands froze, a rose slipping from her fingers. "Fraud? No, Monsieur Poirot, he never mentioned anything like that to me." Poirot stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Yet you were privy to his letters, his meetings. You overheard things, perhaps. An argument, maybe, between Lord Ashford and Monsieur Vernon." Her lips tightened, and for a moment Poirot thought she would deny it. Then, with a sigh, she said, "I did hear them argue, yes. It was 2 days ago, in the study. Mr. Vernon was furious about a deal that went wrong, a merger, I think. He said Lord Ashford had misled him, cost him millions. But that's all I know." Poirot nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Clara's admission was useful, but it felt rehearsed, as if she were offering just enough to satisfy him without revealing too much. He decided to press further. "And this willow trust, mademoiselle, what do you know of it?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise before she masked it. "The Willow Trust, it's a charity Lord Ashford supported. He donated to it regularly. I handled the paperwork." "Regularly, you say?" Poirot's voice was soft, almost soothing. "And yet, it is curious, Nan, that this charity is now the heir to his fortune." "A charity you managed, mademoiselle. Tell me, what does it do?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the stem of a rose. "It supports orphans, I believe. Education, housing, that sort of thing." Poirot smiled, but it was a smile that held no warmth. "Orphans, how noble. And yet, I find it strange that Lord Ashford never mentioned this charity to his wife or nephew. Perhaps there is more to it. Clara's composure faltered, her cheeks paling. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. I only did what he asked. Of course, Poirot said, bowing slightly. But the truth, mademoiselle, has a way of revealing itself. And the first Hercule Poirot am its faithful servant. As he left the conservatory, Poirot's mind churned with possibilities. The will, the fraud, the charity, they were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still unclear. Clara knew more than she was saying, and Vernon's argument with Ashford suggested a financial motive. But what of Lady Eleanor and Dr. Marlowe? Their roles were less clear, yet Poirot sensed they were not innocent bystanders. That afternoon, he sought out Lady Eleanor, finding her in the drawing-room, staring at a portrait of her late husband. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her posture was composed, as if she were determined to maintain her dignity. Madame, Poirot said gently, I must ask you about your husband's will. Did you know he intended to leave his estate to a charity? Lady Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. A charity? No, that's impossible. Reginald always said Charles would inherit. He was grooming him to take over the business. And yet, Poirot said, producing the will, this document tells a different story. The will or trust is the primary beneficiary. Did your husband ever mention this trust to you? She took the document, her hands trembling as she read. No, she whispered. He never said a word. Why would he do this? Why would he keep it from me? Poirot studied her closely. Her shock seemed genuine, but he had learned long ago that grief could mask guilt. Perhaps, madame, there were things your husband did not wish you to know, secrets he kept even from you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Poirot left her with the will, knowing it would stir emotions and perhaps loosen tongues. Next, he confronted Charles, who was in the billiard room, idly rolling balls across the table. The young man looked up, his expression a mix of defiance and fear. Monsieur Charles, Poirot said, your uncle's will has been found. It leaves you nothing. Were you aware of this? Charles's face went pale, his hand freezing on the cue. Nothing. That's not possible. He promised me. Promises, Poirot interrupted, are not always kept. Tell me, did you know of the Willow Trust? Charles shook his head, his eyes darting away. Never heard of it. Uncle Reginald wasn't one for charities. He was all about family, legacy. Yet he chose to leave his legacy to strangers, Poirot said. Curious, Nan. Unless, perhaps, you gave him reason to doubt your loyalty. Charles slammed the cue down, his voice rising. What are you implying, Poirot? I didn't kill him. I loved him. Poirot raised a hand, his tone calm but firm. Love, monsieur, can coexist with ambition, and ambition can lead to desperate acts. As Charles stormed out, Poirot's thoughts turned to Dr. Marlowe. The physician was in the garden, tending to a rosebush with a care that seemed almost meditative. Poirot approached, his steps deliberate. Doctor, he said, you have been most quiet in this affair, yet you knew Lord Ashford well. Tell me, what did you know of his business dealings? Marlowe's hands paused, a thorn pricking his finger. He sucked the blood away, his expression unreadable. I'm a doctor, not a businessman, Monsieur Poirot. Reginald's finances were his own affair, and his health, Poirot pressed. You treated him. Did he ever speak of threats, of enemies? Marlowe hesitated, then said, "He was under stress, yes. He mentioned trouble with his company, but nothing specific. I prescribed rest, but—" He wouldn't listen. Poirot nodded, but his eyes lingered on Marlowe's hands, steady despite the thorn sting. A doctor's hands, trained to heal or to harm. And poisons, docteur. You are familiar with them, oui. Marlowe's gaze met Poirot's, cool and direct. Every doctor knows poisons, Monsieur Poirot, but knowing is not doing. Indeed, Poirot said, smiling faintly. But knowledge, like a weapon, can be wielded by the wrong hands. As the day wore on, Poirot pieced together the fragments of information. The will pointed to a motive tied to money. The fraud suggested a conspiracy within Ashford's company, and Clara's knowledge of the Willow Trust hinted at her involvement. Vernon's argument with Ashford added another layer, but Poirot sensed there was more to uncover. He needed to test his suspicions, to push the suspects into revealing their true selves. That evening, he gathered them again, this time in the dining room where the fateful dinner had taken place. The long table was set with the same crystal, and silver, a grim reminder of the night before. Poirot stood at the head, his presence commanding despite his small stature. "Mes amis," he said, "I have learned much today, but the truth remains elusive. Lord Ashford was a man of secrets, and those secrets led to his death. I propose a small experiment, a reenactment of last night's dinner. We shall sit as we did, speak as we did, and perhaps the truth will reveal itself." Chapter 5. Hidden secrets surfaced the morning after Lord Reginald Ashford's shocking death at Ashford Manor. The air was thick with suspicion and unease. Hercule Poirot, ever the meticulous observer, stood in the grand library, his small, precise frame dwarfed by towering shelves of leather-bound books. The room was a sanctuary of knowledge, yet it held secrets as dark as the oak panels lining its walls. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of distrust that hung over the manor's inhabitants. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, noting the faint dust on untouched volumes, the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering from the previous evening, and the nervous glances exchanged among the guests as they gathered at his request. Poirot had called the key suspects Lady Eleanor Ashford, Charles Ashford, Dr. Theodore Marlowe, Miss Clara Winston, and Mr. Harold Vernon to the library under the pretense of discussing the investigation's progress. In truth, he wanted to observe them, to peel back the layers of their carefully constructed facades. Each had a motive, a thread in the tangled web of Lord Ashford's death, and Poirot was determined to find the one that led to the killer. His little grey cells, as he fondly called them, were already at work, piecing together fragments of conversations, gestures, and clues from the night before. Lady Eleanor, regal in her morning black, sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, her delicate hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her pale face was a mask of grief, but Poirot noted the way her eyes darted toward the others, as if searching for something or someone to blame. Charles, the late lord's ambitious nephew, paced near the fireplace, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. His boyish charm was overshadowed by a restless energy, his fingers tugging at his cufflinks as though they constrained him. Dr. Marlowe, the family, friend, and physician, leaned against a bookshelf, his calm demeanour betraying nothing, though Poirot noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his spectacles. Miss Clara Winston, Lord Ashford's secretary, sat primly at a writing desk, her auburn hair neatly pinned, her expression one of studied neutrality. Yet her fingers, poised over a notepad, tapped an erratic rhythm. Mr. Vernon, the rival businessman, stood apart, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set in defiance, as if daring anyone to accuse him. "Mies, Amos," Poirot began, his voice smooth and deliberate. "We are gathered here to discuss the tragedy that has befallen Lord Ashford. A man does not die by poison in a locked room without a purpose, Nan. And so I, Hercule Poirot, have begun to unravel the threads of this mystery. But first, I must ask for your patience and your honesty." The word honesty hung in the air, and Poirot's keen eyes caught the subtle shifts in posture. Lady Eleanor's hands tightened. Charles paused mid-step. Dr. Marlowe's lips twitched. Clara's pen stilled, and Vernon's gaze hardened. They were all hiding something, Poirot was certain. But the question was, who hid the darkest secret? He paced slowly, his polished shoes silent on the rug, his hands clasped behind his back. "Last night I observed many things. The glass of wine half empty beside Lord Ashford's body, the peculiar burn mark on his desk, the window open, yet with no trace of footprints in the dew-soaked grass below. These are not mere details. None, they are the language of the crime, and I, Poirot, am fluent in it." Lady Eleanor spoke first, her voice trembling but firm. "Monsieur Poirot, surely you don't suspect any of us. Reginald was beloved. Who would want to harm him?" Poirot tilted his head, his moustache twitching slightly. "Beloved? Madame, perhaps. But even the most beloved have enemies. A man of Lord Ashford's wealth and influence collects adversaries as a collector gathers rare coins. And so, I must ask, what secrets did he keep from you, his wife?" Her eyes widened, and a flush crept up her neck. "Secrets? I don't know what you mean. Reginald was an open book to me." "An open book, madame." Poirot's tone was gentle, but probing. "Yet books have hidden chapters, do they not? Pages tucked away, unseen by even the closest reader." Before Lady Eleanor could respond, Charles interjected, his voice sharp. "This is absurd, Poirot. My uncle was a good man, but he wasn't perfect. He had business rivals, yes, but nothing to warrant this." He gestured vaguely, as if the word murder was too heavy to utter. Poirot turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Monsieur Charles, you speak of rivals. Perhaps you refer to Monsieur Vernon." He glanced at the businessman, who stiffened. "Or perhaps there is another matter of inheritance. Tell me, what did you stand to gain from your uncle's death?" Charles's face reddened. "That's a low blow, Poirot. I loved my uncle." "I'd never enough." "Charles," Vernon cut in, his voice a low growl. "The detective's just doing his job. But if you're looking for motives, look at the books. Ashford's company was bleeding money. Some of us warned him, but he wouldn't listen." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And you, Monsieur Vernon, stood to lose much in this failed venture, Nan. A business deal gone sour, perhaps. Enough to drive a man to extreme measures." Vernon's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Poirot noted the silence, filing it away like a piece of evidence. He turned to Miss Clara, who had been quiet, her eyes fixed on her notepad. "Mademoiselle Winston, you were Lord Ashford's secretary. You knew his affairs, his correspondence. Did you, perhaps, know of a secret that weighed heavily on his mind?" Clara's lips parted, then closed. She adjusted her glasses, her movements deliberate. "Lord Ashford was a private man, Monsieur Poirot. I handled his schedules, his letters, but he didn't confide in me about personal matters. Yet you were in the manor yesterday afternoon, before the dinner, Poirot said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. You had access to his study, did you not? A flicker of unease crossed her face, but she recovered quickly. I was preparing documents for him, that's all. Poirot nodded, as if satisfied, but his mind was racing. Clara's composure was a mask, and he intended to crack it. He turned to Dr. Marlowe, who had remained silent, his arms crossed. And you, Docteur, a man of medicine. You know the ways of poisons. A rare toxin, perhaps, one that could kill swiftly and leave little trace. Dr. Marlowe's eyes met Poirot's, steady and unflinching. I'm a doctor, not a murderer, Monsieur Poirot. I treated Lord Ashford for years. If anything, I wanted him to live. Been, sir, Poirot said, smiling faintly. But the heart of a man is a complex thing, is it not? Sometimes loyalty hides other passions. The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words settling over the group. He had planted seeds of doubt, and now he would watch them grow. But he needed something concrete to tie the threads together. That opportunity came sooner than expected. As the group dispersed, Poirot lingered in the library, his eyes drawn to a locked drawer in Lord Ashford's desk. The butler, Mr. Hargrove, a stooped man with a perpetually anxious expression, had mentioned that Ashford kept sensitive documents there. With Hargrove's reluctant assistance, Poirot obtained the key and opened the drawer. Inside was a single document, sealed with red wax, Lord Ashford's last will and testament. Poirot broke the seal and read, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the contents. The will was a revelation, one that turned the case on its head. Contrary to expectations, Charles was not the primary heir. The bulk of Ashford's estate, his manor, his investments, his fortune was bequeathed to a charity called the Willow Trust, an organization Poirot had never heard of. A codicil, dated only a week prior, explicitly disinherited Charles, citing disappointment in his conduct. Lady Eleanor was to receive a modest allowance, enough to live comfortably but far less than her lifestyle demanded. The will mentioned nothing of Vernon, Marlowe, or Clara, which was curious in itself. Poirot's mind raced. Why would Ashford disinherit his nephew? What was the Willow Trust, and why had it been chosen over family? And why had this will been kept secret, locked away where no one could find it? He tucked the document into his pocket, determined to investigate further. His next stop was the manor study, where Miss Clara had been working the previous afternoon. The room was as he'd left it, the half-empty glass of wine, the burn mark on the desk, the open window, but now Poirot's attention was drawn to a small wastebasket in the corner. Kneeling, he sifted through its contents and found a crumpled piece of paper. It was a draft of a letter, written in Ashford's hand, addressed to his solicitor. The words were damning. I have uncovered evidence of fraud within my company. Certain individuals cannot be trusted. I intend to expose them. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but they complied, taking their seats. Poirot watched closely as the servants brought out the same dishes, the same wine. He noted the way Lady Eleanor avoided the wineglass, how Charles's hands shook as he cut his meat, how Clara's eyes flicked toward the door. Vernon ate with grim determination, while Marlowe seemed detached, almost clinical. As the meal progressed, Poirot dropped subtle hints, mentioning the will, the fraud, the charity. He watched their reactions, searching for the telltale signs of guilt. Clara's composure began to crack, her fork clattering against her plate. Vernon's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. Charles drank heavily, his words slurring slightly. Lady Eleanor excused herself early, claiming a headache. Marlowe remained calm, but Poirot noticed a bead of sweat on his temple. The reenactment yielded no confession, but it confirmed Poirot's suspicions. The killer was among them, and they were growing nervous. He needed one final push, a strategy, to break their defenses. That night, as he retired to his room, he began to formulate his genius trigger, psychological ploy that would expose the liar nobody saw coming. The next morning, Poirot visited the village post office, where he sent a telegram to his friend in London, a solicitor who could verify the Willow Trust's legitimacy. The response came quickly. The charity existed, but its records were suspiciously vague, with funds flowing to an offshore account. Clara's name appeared as a trustee, a detail she had conveniently omitted. Armed with this knowledge, Poirot returned to the manor, his plan taking shape. The Willow Trust was the key, and Clara was at its heart, but he needed to be certain, to catch her in a lie so undeniable that she would crumble. He thought of the burn mark, the poison, the locked room. They were clues, yes, but they were also distractions. The real evidence lay in human behavior, in the involuntary tics and tells that betrayed a guilty conscience. He spent the day observing, questioning, probing. He spoke to the servants, who confirmed Clara's frequent visits to the study, often late at night. He examined the manor's layout, discovering a hidden passage behind a bookcase in the study, a passage Clara, as Ashford's secretary, would have known about. He tested the wineglass, finding traces of a chemical residue that matched the burn mark. The pieces were falling into place, but he needed to be sure. By evening, Poirot was ready. He gathered the suspects once more, this time in the study where Ashford had died. The room was unchanged, the air heavy with the memory of death. Poirot stood before them, his eyes gleaming with purpose. "Mies, Amos," he said, "I have devised a method to uncover the truth. A method so precise, so infallible, that no lie can withstand it. I speak of a technique that observes the smallest details, the pulse, the eyes, the breath. The body, you see, cannot lie, even when the mind tries to deceive." He was bluffing, of course, but the effect was immediate. Clara's hands clenched, her eyes darting to the door. Vernon shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering. Charles looked confused, while Lady Eleanor's face paled. Marlowe's expression remained neutral, but his fingers gripped the arm of his chair. Poirot continued, his voice steady. "Tomorrow I shall apply this method. One of you knows the truth, and that truth will be revealed. For now, I bid you good night." As the suspects dispersed, Poirot watched Clara most closely. Her steps were hurried, her composure fraying. He had planted the seed of fear, and now he would wait for it to grow. The trap was set, and the liar would soon be caught. The day had been long, filled with revelations and deceptions, but Poirot felt invigorated. The puzzle was complex, but he was Hercule Poirot, and no puzzle could resist the power of his little grey cells. As he retired to his room, he smiled to himself, knowing that the truth was within his grasp. The Willow Trust, the fraud, the burn mark, they were all threads in the tapestry of murder, and he would weave them together to reveal the killer's face. Tomorrow he would spring his trap, and the liar nobody saw coming would be exposed. Chapter 6. The Art of Observation. The grand dining hall of Ashford Manor, with its towering chandelier casting prismatic glints across the polished mahogany table, seemed to hum with a quiet tension. The echoes of Lord Reginald Ashford's death lingered, and the guests, though outwardly composed, betrayed their unease in subtle ways: a darted glance, a tightened grip on a wine-glass, a forced laugh that rang hollow. Hercule Poirot sat at the head of the table, his small, precise frame almost comically dwarfed by the high-backed chair, yet his presence commanded the room. His moustache, impeccably groomed, twitched slightly as he surveyed the gathered suspects. His sharp green eyes missing nothing. The air was thick with suspicion. The locked room, the poisoned wine, the absence of footprints outside the study window, it was a puzzle designed to confound, and yet Poirot thrived in such intricacies. He had spent the morning interviewing the key suspects. Lady Eleanor, whose delicate hands trembled ever so slightly when she spoke of her late husband. Charles, the ambitious nephew, whose grief seemed rehearsed, as though he had practiced it in front of a mirror. Dr. Marlowe, the family friend, whose calm demeanour and encyclopedic knowledge of toxicology raised Poirot's suspicions. Miss Clara, the quiet secretary, whose unassuming air belied a sharp intelligence, and Mr. Vernon, the rival businessman, whose barely concealed disdain for Ashford suggested a motive rooted in professional enmity. Now, as the afternoon light filtered through the heavy velvet drapes, Poirot had gathered them once more, ostensibly to discuss the evening's events. Further, but his true purpose was far more calculated. He had observed them all, noting the smallest details: the way Lady Eleanor's fingers toyed with her pearl necklace when questioned, the faint sheen of sweat on Charles's brow despite the cool room, Dr. Marlowe's habit of adjusting his spectacles when deflecting personal questions, Miss Clara's tendency to avoid eye contact when discussing her work, and Mr. Vernon's clenched jaw whenever Ashford's business dealings were mentioned. These were the threads of human behaviour, and Poirot, the master weaver, was beginning to see the pattern. "Mies Amos," Poirot began, his voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. "We are gathered here not merely to mourn the tragic loss of Lord Ashford, but to uncover the truth. A crime has been committed, a most ingenious one, and it is my duty and my calling to unravel it. But to do so, I must rely on the most powerful tool at my disposal: observation." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Eleanor, seated to Poirot's left, shifted in her chair, her pale blue eyes flickering toward the empty seat where her husband had presided the previous evening. Charles, at the far end of the table, leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. Dr. Marlowe, ever composed, folded his hands neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable. Miss Clara, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun, scribbled something in her notebook, her pen moving with a precision that Poirot found oddly mechanical. Mr. Vernon, his broad shoulders squared, stared directly at Poirot as though daring him to accuse. "Observation," Poirot continued, "is not merely seeing, it is understanding. It is the noticing of the small things, the gesture, the glance, the pause that betray the heart. And in this room, Mies Amos, there are many such betrayals." A murmur rippled through the group. Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her necklace, her fingers twisting the pearls until Poirot thought they might snap. Charles let out a nervous chuckle, quickly stifled. Dr. Marlowe raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint, almost amused smile. Miss Clara's pen paused, hovering above the page. Mr. Vernon's jaw tightened further. If such a thing were possible, Poirot leaned back in his chair, his hands folded neatly over his waistcoat. "Let us consider, for example, the events of last night. The dinner was, I am told, A most pleasant affair until it was not. Lord Ashford was in good spirits, was he not? He spoke of his plans for the estate, his hopes for the future, and yet someone in this room knew that he would not live to see those plans come to fruition. Someone planned his demise with a precision, that is, I must confess, admirable in its cunning. The room grew quieter, if that were possible. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to grow louder, each second a hammer strike against the nerves of the assembled guests. Poirot's eyes moved from one face to another, cataloguing their reactions. He had learned, over the years, that the truth often lay not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. The flicker of fear, the tightening of a lip, the involuntary twitch of a hand. "Let us begin with a simple question," Poirot said, his tone almost conversational. "Lady Eleanor, you were seated beside your husband during the dinner. Did you notice anything unusual in his demeanour? A hesitation, perhaps, or a moment of discomfort?" Lady Eleanor's eyes widened, and she clutched her necklace tighter. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," she stammered. Reginald was himself, as always. He was charming, jovial. He spoke of the new wing he planned to add to the manor, and her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "Oh, it's too dreadful to think about." Poirot nodded, his expression sympathetic, but his mind racing. Her grief seemed genuine, but there was something in the way her hands moved, the way her eyes darted to the side, that suggested she was holding something back. Was it fear, guilt, or simply the strain of the moment? "And you, Mr. Charles," Poirot said, turning to the nephew. "You were, I believe, seated across from your uncle. You spoke with him at length about the estate, Nan. Did you notice anything out of the ordinary?" Charles straightened, his handsome face arranged in a mask of sorrow. "Uncle Reginald was in fine form," he said, his voice steady but with a slight tremor that Poirot noted. "He was talking about his legacy, how he wanted to ensure the family name endured. I told him I'd do my best to honor his wishes." He paused, swallowing hard. "I had no idea it would be the last time we spoke." Poirot tilted his head, studying Charles's face. The young man's grief was convincing, but there was a theatrical quality to it, as though he had rehearsed the lines too many times. And that pause, had it been a moment of genuine emotion or a calculated effect? "Dr. Marlowe," Poirot said, shifting his attention to the doctor. "You are a man of science, a man accustomed to observing the smallest details. Did you, perhaps, notice anything unusual during the dinner? A guest who seemed out of sorts, or a moment that struck you as odd?" Dr. Marlowe adjusted his spectacles, his movements deliberate. "I'm afraid I was rather absorbed in my conversation with Miss Clara," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "She was telling me about her work on Lord Ashford's correspondence. I didn't notice anything amiss with Reginald until it was too late." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Dr. Marlowe's response was polished, almost too polished, and his mention of Miss Clara, was it a deflection or simply the truth? Poirot made a mental note to explore their connection further. "Miss Clara," Poirot said, turning to the secretary, "you were, I understand, responsible for organizing the dinner. You saw to the seating arrangements, the menu, the wine. Did you notice anything unusual in the preparation or during the evening itself?" Miss Clara looked up from her notebook, her dark eyes meeting Poirot's for a brief moment before dropping back to the page. "Everything was in order," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The staff followed my instructions precisely. The wine was decanted as Lord Ashford preferred, and the meal was served promptly. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Poirot noted the precision of her response, the way she seemed to choose each word with care. There was no hesitation, no nervousness, said that very lack of emotion was itself suspicious. Was she simply efficient, or was she hiding something? "And you, Mr. Vernon," Poirot said, his gaze settling on the businessman. "You were, I believe, engaged in a heated discussion with Lord Ashford earlier in the evening. Something about a business deal, Nan. Did you notice anything in his behavior that might shed light on this tragedy?" Vernon's eyes flashed with irritation. "Ashford was stubborn, as always," he said gruffly. "We disagreed about a contract, but that's hardly unusual. He was alive and well when I left." "Him? If you're implying I had anything to do with his death, you're barking up the wrong tree." Poirot raised a hand, his expression placating. "I imply nothing, monsieur. I merely observe, and what I observe is that each of you, in your own way, holds a piece of the puzzle. But which piece is the key? That is what Hercule Poirot must discover." The room fell silent again, the weight of Poirot's words settling over the group like a fog. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Let me share with you a little theory of mine," he said. "I believe that there was a witness to this crime, not a person, perhaps, but a detail, a clue that saw what happened. And I, Hercule Poirot, will find it." The effect was immediate. Lady Eleanor gasped, her handkerchief falling to the table. Charles's eyes widened, and he leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. Dr. Marlowe's smile faltered, just for a moment. Miss Clara's pen scratched across the page, leaving an ink blot. Mr. Vernon's jaw clenched so tightly that Poirot thought he might crack a tooth. Poirot sat back, satisfied. The seed had been planted. He had no witness, of course no concrete evidence, yet but the suggestion of one was enough to unsettle the guilty party. The human mind, he knew, was its own worst enemy. A liar, when pressed, would reveal themselves. Through their fear, their overcompensation, their need to control the narrative. And Poirot was a master at pressing. The afternoon wore on, and Poirot continued his observations, moving through the manor with the precision of a chess master. He lingered in the drawing-room, where Lady Eleanor sat with a cup of tea, her hands still trembling. He watched as she glanced nervously at the door whenever someone entered, as though expecting an accusation to walk through. Was it guilt, or merely the strain of widowhood? In the library, he found Charles pacing, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. When Poirot entered, Charles stopped abruptly, his face flushing. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice tight, "have you found anything yet? Any clue about who did this to Uncle?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Patience, monsieur. The truth reveals itself in its own time. But tell me, why are you so anxious? Is there something you wish to share?" Charles shook his head, too quickly. No, nothing like that. I want justice for him, that's all." Poirot nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Charles's anxiety was palpable, but was it the anxiety of a guilty man, or simply a grieving nephew eager for answers? The distinction was subtle, and Poirot would need more time to discern it. In the conservatory, Poirot found Dr. Marlowe examining a collection of exotic plants, his fingers brushing lightly over the leaves. "A fascinating collection," Poirot remarked, approaching the doctor. "Lord Ashford had an interest in botany, did he not?" Dr. Marlowe glanced up, his expression guarded. "He did," he said. Reginald was particularly fond of rare species. Some of these plants are quite potent in the right hands. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Potent, you say? In what way? Dr. Marlowe hesitated, then smiled. Oh, merely in their medicinal properties. Some can be used to treat ailments, but in the wrong hands they could be dangerous. Not that anyone here would misuse them, of course. Of course, Poirot echoed, his tone neutral but his mind racing. Dr. Marlowe's knowledge of plant sand, by extension, poisons, was a thread worth pursuing. Had he mentioned the plants deliberately to deflect suspicion, or was it an innocent remark? Miss Clara, meanwhile, was in her small office, sorting through a stack of papers with her usual efficiency. Poirot knocked lightly on the door frame, and she looked up, her expression unreadable. Monsieur Poirot, she said, setting down her pen, how can I assist you? I merely wish to understand your role here, mademoiselle, Poirot said. Stepping into the room, you were Lord Ashford's secretary, oui. You handled his correspondence, his appointments. You must have known him well. Miss Clara nodded. I did my best to serve him, she said. He was a demanding employer, but fair. I still can't believe he's gone. Her voice was steady, but Poirot noticed the way her hands folded tightly in her lap, the knuckles white. You were in the Manor all day yesterday, were you not? He asked. Did you, perhaps, see anyone near the study before the dinner? Miss Clara shook her head. No, I was busy with preparations. I didn't notice anything unusual. Poirot nodded, but his eyes lingered on her notebook, where the ink blot from earlier still marred the page. A small thing, perhaps, but to Poirot, no detail was too small. His final stop was Mr. Vernon, whom he found in the billiard-room, idly rolling a cue ball across the table. The businessman looked up as Poirot entered, his expression wary. What now, Poirot? He asked, his tone gruff. More questions? Always, Monsieur Poirot said with a small smile. But this time I am curious about your disagreement with Lord Ashford. It was, I understand, quite heated. What was the nature of your dispute? Vernon snorted. Business. What else? Ashford thought he could outmaneuver me in a deal, but I wasn't having it. We argued, sure, but I didn't kill him over it. Poirot tilted his head. And yet you were angry. Angry enough, perhaps, to wish him harm. Vernon's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, Poirot. I'm no saint, but I'm no murderer either. Poirot raised his hands in a placating gesture. I merely seek the truth, monsieur. And the truth, I find, often lies in the heat of such moments. As the day drew to a close, Poirot retired to his room, his mind a whirl of observations. He sat at the small writing desk, his notebook open before him, and began to jot down his thoughts. Lady Eleanor's nervousness, Charles's rehearsed grief, Dr. Marlowe's knowledge of poisons, Miss Clara's calm efficiency, Mr. Vernon's barely contained anger each was a piece of the puzzle, but none yet formed the whole picture. He thought back to his earlier pronouncement about a witness to the crime. It had been a calculated move, designed to unsettle the guilty party, and it had worked. Each suspect had reacted in their own way to the suggestion. But whose reaction was the most telling? Lady Eleanor's gasp, Charles's wide-eyed panic, Dr. Marlowe's faltering smile, Miss Clara's ink blot, or Mr. Vernon's clenched jaw. Poirot closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The truth was there, hidden in the small things, the gestures, the glances, the pauses. He would continue to observe, to press, to provoke, until the liar revealed themselves. For Hercule Poirot, the art of observation was not just a skill, was a weapon, and he wielded it with unmatched precision. The evening settled over Ashford Manor, the shadows lengthening across the grounds. Poirot stood at his window, gazing out at the manicured lawns, his mind still turning. The game was afoot, and he was ready to play it to its conclusion. The liar, he knew, was watching him as closely as he was watching them, and that, he thought with a faint smile, was exactly what he wanted. Chapter 7. A clever disguise. The dining room of Ashford Manor was a study in opulence, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow the guests with silent judgment. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror-like sheen, still bore the remnants of the ill-fated dinner wine glasses smudged with fingerprints, silverware askew, and napkins crumpled in haste. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and the lingering tension of a crime unsolved. Hercule Poirot stood at the head of the table, his small, fastidious figure commanding the room with an authority that belied his stature. His eyes, sharp and green as a cat's, swept over the assembled guests, each of whom sat in their original places from the night of Lord Reginald. Ashford's death. The reenactment of the dinner was Poirot's idea, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to unsettle the suspects and coax the truth from the shadows. The chandelier above cast a warm, flickering glow, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the group. Lady Eleanor Ashford, regal yet brittle, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her diamond bracelet catching the light with every nervous twitch. Charles, the nephew, slouched in his chair, his boyish face set in a scowl that barely masked his unease. Dr. Marlowe, the family friend, adjusted his spectacles with a practiced calm, though his fingers lingered a moment too long on the frames. Miss Clara, the secretary, sat ramrod straight, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting to the empty seat where Lord Ashford had presided. Mr. Vernon, the rival businessman, leaned back with an air of defiance, his heavy jaw set as if daring anyone to accuse him. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, his moustache twitching slightly as he surveyed the scene. "Madame et messieurs," he began, his voice smooth and precise, with the faintest trace of his Belgian accent. "Tonight we recreate the events of that tragic evening, not to mourn, but to observe. The truth, it hides in the details, and it is in the details that Hercule Poirot will find it." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. The servants, under Poirot's strict instructions, began to move, replicating the motions of the dinner. Plates were set, wine was poured, and the clink of cutlery filled the air. Poirot had insisted on precision. Every gesture, every moment was to mirror the night of the murder. He had spent the morning interrogating the staff, piecing together the sequence of events. Who had served what? Who had spoken to whom? Who had left the table and when? The butler, Mr. Grayson, a stooped man with a perpetually furrowed brow, had been particularly helpful, though his memory was clouded by the shock of his employer's death. Poirot had listened patiently, his head tilted, his fingers steepled, as Grayson recounted the evening's timeline. Now, as the reenactment began, Poirot moved silently around the table, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. He paused behind Lady Eleanor, noting the way her shoulders stiffened as a servant placed a glass of red wine before her. "The wine, Lady Eleanor," Poirot said softly, almost conversationally. "You drank very little that night, did you?" "Not Yet your glass. It was nearly empty when I examined it. Lady Eleanor's head snapped up, her blue eyes wide. I don't recall, she stammered. It was a hectic evening. Perhaps I spilled it. Perhaps, Poirot said, his tone neutral but his eyes piercing. He moved on, circling to Charles, who was fidgeting with his fork. Monsieur Charles, you were seated here, next to your uncle. You spoke of a business venture, I believe. Something about an investment in South America. Charles's jaw tightened, and he shot a quick glance at Vernon across the table. Yes, well, it was just talk. Uncle Reginald wasn't keen on it. Nan, he was not. Poirot agreed, his voice deceptively mild. Yet you pressed the matter, did you not? Quite insistently. According to the butler, Charles flushed, his knuckles whitening around the fork. I wasn't the only one talking business, he muttered, his eyes flicking toward Vernon again. Ask him about his deal with Uncle. That went south, didn't it? Vernon's chair creaked as he leaned forward, his voice low and gravelly. Careful, boy. You're treading on thin ice. My business with Ashford was above board, unlike some of your schemes. Enough, Poirot said sharply, raising a hand. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Poirot's gaze lingered on Vernon, whose defiant posture seemed to falter under the detective's scrutiny. We are here to recreate, not to accuse it. He emphasized the last word, letting it hang in the air like a guillotine blade. The reenactment continued, with Poirot subtly altering details to test the suspect's reactions. He instructed the servants to serve the soup course a few minutes earlier than they had on the night of the murder, and he watched as Dr. Marlowe frowned, his fingers tapping the table. This isn't right, Marlowe said, almost to himself. The soup came after the salad. Poirot's mustache twitched. A small detail, Doctor, yet you notice it. Most interesting? Marlowe's frown deepened, but he said nothing. Adjusting his spectacles again next, Poirot had the servants skip the fish course entirely, moving straight to the main course of roasted pheasant. Miss Clara's head jerked up, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. There was fish, she said, her voice clipped. Trout with lemon sauce. Indeed, Poirot said, feigning surprise. You have a remarkable memory, Mademoiselle Clara, for someone who claims to have been distracted by paperwork that evening. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her plate. I pay attention, she said quietly. It's my job. Beans, sir, Poirot murmured, but his eyes gleamed with interest. He moved to the sideboard, where a decanter of wine stood, identical to the one from which Lord Ashford's fatal glass had been poured. The wine, he said, lifting the decanter and holding it to the light. It was poured from this, Nan. Yet the bottle, it was not tested for poison until after the police arrived. A curious oversight. Lady Eleanor's bracelet jangled as she reached for her glass, then stopped. Herself? The police said the poison was in his glass, not the bottle, she said, her voice trembling slightly. So they did, Poirot said, setting the decanter down with exaggerated care. But the glass, it was half empty. Did Lord Ashford drink so quickly? Or was the poison added later, perhaps when all eyes were elsewhere? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Poirot resumed his pacing, his mind working furiously. The reenactment was not just a performance, it was a psychological experiment, designed to expose the cracks in the suspect's carefully constructed facades. He had learned, over his long career, that guilt often betrayed itself in the smallest of ways, a glance, a hesitation, a too quick denial. Tonight, he was watching for those signs, planting seeds of doubt to see which would take root. As the servants cleared the plates, Poirot paused near the fireplace, where a portrait of Lord Ashford loomed over the room. The late lord's eyes, painted with uncanny realism, seemed to bore into the guests, amplifying their unease. Poirot turned to face them, his expression grave. "There is one detail I have not yet mentioned," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A witness, someone who saw something that night, something they have not yet revealed." The effect was immediate. Lady Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Charles's fork clattered to his plate. Dr. Marlowe's fingers froze on his spectacles, and Vernon's jaw clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed in his temple. Only Miss Clara remained still, her eyes fixed on Poirot, unblinking. "A witness," Vernon said, his voice rough. "Who? Why haven't they come forward?" Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes never leaving Clara. "That, Monsieur Vernon, is what I intend to find out. The witness, they are cautious, but they will speak in time." The lie was a calculated risk. There was no witness, at least, not yet. But Poirot knew the power of suggestion, the way a guilty mind could unravel under the weight of imagined scrutiny. He watched Clara closely, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. She was hiding something, he was certain of it, but what? The reenactment concluded with dessert, a chocolate torte that no one touched. The guests were too on edge, their appetites soured by Poirot's probing. As the servants cleared the table, Poirot clapped his hands, drawing everyone's attention. "Merci, Mies, Amos, for your patience. Tonight we have seen much. The truth, it is closer now, but it remains elusive. Tomorrow we will continue our little investigation." He dismissed the guests, but his eyes lingered on Vernon, who stormed out of the room, his heavy footsteps echoing in the hall. Clara rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she were measuring each step. Dr. Marlowe offered Lady Eleanor his arm, murmuring something about a sedative, while Charles lingered by the door, his expression sullen. Poirot remained in the dining room, alone now except for the butler, who was extinguishing the candles. "Monsieur Grayson," Poirot said, his tone casual, "on the night of the murder, you said Miss Clara left the dining room briefly, did you not?" Grayson nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he snuffed out a flame. "Yes, sir. She said she needed to fetch some papers from the study. She was gone perhaps 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Poirot repeated, his eyes narrowing. "And the study, it is where Lord Ashford was found, locked from the inside." Grayson paled. "I didn't think anything of it at the time, sir. She often went to the study for work." "Of course," Poirot said, patting the butler's arm. "You have been most helpful, monsieur." As Grayson retreated, Poirot stood alone in the dimly lit room, his mind racing. 10 minutes was more than enough time to slip into the study, administer the poison, and return unnoticed. But the locked door, how had Clara managed it? And why had she remained so composed during the reenactment, only to falter at the mention of a witness? Poirot's fingers brushed the edge of the table, his thoughts turning to the burn mark in the study. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but to Poirot it was a beacon. The poison, he suspected, had been spilled accidentally, leaving a trace that the killer had not anticipated. Clara, with her access to the study and her knowledge of Ashford's habits, was a strong candidate. But Vernon's agitation could not be ignored, nor could Dr. Marlowe's expertise with poisons, nor Lady Eleanor's nervous demeanour, nor Charles's desperate need for money. The web was tangled, but Poirot was patient. He would unravel it, thread by thread, until the truth lay bare. For now, he had planted the seed of doubt, and he would watch it grow. The reenactment had served its purpose, exposing the suspect's vulnerabilities. Tomorrow, he would press harder, using his witness to tighten the noose. Poirot straightened his bow tie, his reflection in the polished silver of a serving tray catching his eye. The little grey cells, he murmured to himself, they are never idle. With a satisfied nod, he turned and left the dining room, the shadows of Ashford Manor closing in behind him. The night was still young, and the game was far from over. Chapter 8. The genius trick begins. The air in Ashford Manor seemed to thicken as the investigation reached its 8th day. Hercule Poirot, with his impeccable moustache and sharp eyes, stood at the centre of the drawing-room, where the remaining guests and suspects had gathered at his request. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting long shadows across the ornate wallpaper, but it did little to warm the atmosphere of suspicion that hung over the assembly. The death of Lord Reginald Ashford, poisoned in his locked study, had left everyone on edge, and Poirot's relentless probing had only heightened their unease. Now he was about to unveil a tactic so bold, so unexpected, that it would shake the very foundations of their composure. Poirot adjusted his bow tie, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical, as he surveyed the faces before him. Lady Eleanor. Ashford sat rigidly on a velvet-upholstered chair, her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously toward the others. Charles Ashford, the late lord's nephew, leaned against the mantelpiece, his casual posture betrayed by the tension in his jaw. Dr. Marlowe, the family friend and physician, stood near the window, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but for a faint tightening around his eyes. Miss Clara, the secretary, perched on the edge of a sofa, her notebook clutched like a shield, her face a mask of calm that seemed almost too perfect. Mr. Vernon, the rival businessman, paced near the doorway, his heavy footsteps a counterpoint to the quiet crackle of the fire. Each of them, Poirot knew, was hiding something, whether it was guilt, fear, or merely resentment at being scrutinized. Mes amis, Poirot began, his voice smooth and measured, carrying the weight of authority. That made everyone pause. We have spent these past days in the pursuit of truth, unravelling the threads of this most perplexing crime. The death of Lord Ashford, locked in his study, poisoned by a substance most rare, is no simple matter. It is a puzzle designed to confound, to mislead. But Hercule Poirot does not permit himself to be misled. Nan, I have observed, I have listened, and now I am prepared to take a step most extraordinary. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Poirot's eyes moved from one face to another, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the quick glances exchanged. He had spent the morning reviewing his notes, piecing together the fragments of evidence, the half-empty glass of wine, the strange burn mark on the desk, the open window with no footprints beneath it, and the secret will that had turned motives upside down. But evidence alone was not enough. To catch a liar, one needed to probe the mind, to unsettle the heart. And so, Poirot had devised his genius tricker psychological gambit that would rely not on facts, but on the frailties of human nature. I have developed, Poirot continued, his tone taking on a conspiratorial edge, a method most unique, a technique that allows me to detect the presence of a lie. It is not a matter of guesswork, Nan, nor of mere intuition. It is a science, mes amis, based on the involuntary cues of the body, the pulse that quickens, the eye that betrays, the hand that trembles ever so slightly. These are the signs that no liar, no matter how clever, can conceal from Hercule Poirot. A murmur rippled through the group. Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened on her handkerchief, and Charles's hand paused midway to his cigarette case. Dr. Marlowe's brow furrowed, though he quickly smoothed his expression. Clara's pen, poised over her notebook, hesitated for a fraction of a second. Vernon stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he fixed Poirot with a skeptical stare. "A lie detector," Vernon said, his voice laced with disbelief. "You expect us to believe you've got some sort of machine hidden up your sleeve?" Poirot smiled, a small, enigmatic smile that revealed nothing. "Not a machine, Monsieur Vernon, a method. System of observation so precise that it is as effective as any device. The human body, you see, is its own betrayer. When one lies, the heart races, the pupils dilate, the breath catches. These are not things one can control, no matter how practiced. The deception, and I, Hercule Poirot, have trained my eyes to see what others miss." It was, of course, a bluffer, masterful one. Poirot had no such method in the scientific sense. His tool was observation, honed over decades of solving crimes, coupled with an understanding of human psychology. By announcing this fictional technique, he intended to unsettle the guilty party, to make them fear that their every gesture was under scrutiny. A liar, when confronted with the possibility of exposure, would react perhaps subtly, perhaps overtly, but react they would, and Poirot would be watching. He began to pace slowly, his polished shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. "This evening," he said, "I shall ask each of you a series of questions, simple questions, designed to establish the truth. But be warned, my method will reveal any attempt to deceive. I advise you to speak plainly for your own sakes." Lady Elena's voice broke the silence, high and brittle. "This is absurd, Monsieur Poirot. Are we to be interrogated like criminals? My husband is dead, and you treat us as if we're all guilty." Madame Poirot said gently, turning to her, "It is precisely because your husband is dead that we must proceed with such care. A murderer walks among us, and I will not rest until they are unmasked. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear from my questions, or my method." Lady Eleanor opened her mouth to protest further, but no. Words came. She sank back into her chair, her face pale. Poirot noted the way her hands twisted the handkerchief, the slight tremor in her fingers. Fear, perhaps, but of what? Grief for her husband, or something more? He turned to Charles, who had lit his cigarette and was exhaling a cloud of smoke. With studied nonchalance, "Monsieur Charles," Poirot said, "you were seated near your uncle during the dinner. Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior? Perhaps a moment when he seemed distressed, or when someone approached his glass of wine?" Charles shrugged, his eyes flicking to the others before returning to Poirot. Nothing out of the ordinary. Uncle Reginald was his usual self, a bit pompous. "I didn't see anyone tampering with his wine, if that's what you're getting at." Poirot nodded, his expression neutral. But he noted the slight pause before Charles's answer, the way his eyes had darted to Clara before he spoke. "Merci, Monsieur Charles. We shall return to you later." Next, he addressed Dr. Marlowe. "Doctor, your expertise in medicine is well known. Tell me, Have you ever encountered a poison so rare that it could kill swiftly, leaving no trace except, perhaps, a faint chemical residue? Dr. Marlowe's arms remained crossed, but his fingers tightened briefly on his sleeves. I've studied toxicology, of course, he said evenly. There are such poison synthetic compounds, rare botanicals, but I'd need more specifics to comment. What are you suggesting, Poirot? Merely seeking your knowledge, Dr. Poirot replied, his tone light. He observed the doctor's steady gaze, the controlled posture. Marlowe was composed, but there was a rigidity to his stance that suggested he was guarding himself. Poirot moved on to Miss Clara. Mademoiselle, you were Lord Ashford's secretary. You had access to his private correspondence, his schedule. Did you ever notice anything unusual in the days before his death? A visitor, perhaps, or a letter that caused him distress? Clara's face remained serene, her voice calm as she replied. Lord Ashford was a busy man, Monsieur Poirot. He received many letters, some of which upset him, but nothing stood out as unusual. I reported everything I overheard to you already. The argument with Mr. Vernon, for instance. You did, Poirot said, his eyes lingering on her. Her composure was remarkable, almost too perfect. He noted the way her hands rested lightly on her notebook, without the nervous fidgeting he had seen in others. Was it confidence or calculation? Finally, he turned to Vernon. Monsieur Vernon, your business dealings with Lord Ashford were not always amicable, Nan. Tell me, what was the nature of your discussion with him on the evening of the dinner? Vernon's face reddened slightly, his voice gruff. We had a disagreement about a contract, nothing more. Ashford was stubborn, but I didn't kill him over it. I was in the dining room all evening, as everyone can attest. Indeed, Poirot said, his tone neutral. He observed Vernon's clenched fists, the way his eyes avoided meeting Poirot's. Directly, anger perhaps, but was it the anger of a guilty man or merely a frustrated one? Poirot stepped back, clasping his hands behind his back. Mercy, all of you, for your cooperation. But let me be clear, my method is already at work. Even now, I observe the signs, the quickened breath, the averted gaze, the subtle tremor. The liar among you cannot hide for long. The room seemed to grow smaller, the tension palpable. Poirot's words had done their work, planting seeds of doubt and fear. He watched as Lady Eleanor's handkerchief twisted tighter, as Charles's cigarette burned down to a stub, as Dr. Marlowe's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Clara's pen tapped once, twice, against her notebook before she stilled it. Vernon resumed pacing, his steps heavier now. Poirot knew that his bluff was only the beginning. The true test would come in the hours and days that followed, as the guilty party wrestled with the fear of exposure. He had set the trap, and now he would watch, with his little grey cells attuned to every detail, for the moment when the liar betrayed themselves. As the group dispersed, Poirot remained by the hearth, his mind racing. The burn mark on the desk, the secret will, the hidden passage he suspected existed in the manor all, were pieces of the puzzle. But it was the human element, the psychology of deception, that would lead him to the truth. His genius trick had begun, and he was certain it would yield results. The evening wore on, and Poirot retired to his room, but not to rest. He sat at the small desk, his notebook open, jotting down observations from the evening's interrogation. Lady Eleanor's nervous hands, Charles's evasive glance, Dr. Marlowe's guarded demeanour, Clara's unnatural calm, Vernon's barely contained frustration, each was a clue, a thread to be woven into the tapestry of truth. He recalled that reenactment of the dinner he had staged the previous evening, a subtle test to provoke reactions. Vernon's agitation when Poirot had suggested someone had lingered near the wine decanter. Clara's calm assurance when questioned about her movements. These were not accidents. Someone in that room knew more than they were saying, and Poirot's bluff about his lie detection method was designed to push them to the breaking point. As he wrote, Poirot's thoughts drifted to the burn mark on the desk. It was an anomaly, a detail that did not fit the narrative of a clean, calculated poisoning. He suspected it was the result of a chemical reaction, perhaps from the poison itself, spilled in a moment of carelessness. If so, it pointed to someone who had been in the study before the dinner, someone with access and opportunity. Clara, as Ashford's secretary, had been in the manor all day. Dr. Marlowe, too, had arrived early, ostensibly to check on Ashford's health. Both were viable suspects, but Poirot needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, his mind a whirl of possibilities. The genius trick was not merely about the bluff. It was about creating a pressure cooker, forcing the guilty party to act, to make a mistake. Poirot had seen it before. A liar, when cornered, would either confess or overplay their hand, revealing their guilt in a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion. The clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the silent manor. Poirot closed his notebook and stood, his resolve firm. Tomorrow he would push further, dropping more hints about his method, observing every reaction with the precision of a surgeon. The liar was among them, and they would not escape Hercule Poirot. The next morning, Poirot gathered the suspects again, this time in the library. The room was lined with shelves of leather-bound books, their spines gleaming in the morning light. The atmosphere was no less tense than the previous evening. If anything, it was more so. Poirot had instructed the staff to serve coffee, a deliberate choice to keep everyone alert and, perhaps a little on edge. Bon matin, he greeted them, his voice cheerful but with an undercurrent of steel. Today, we continue our pursuit of the truth. My method, as I explained, is infallible, but I am a fair man, and I offer you this opportunity to speak freely. If there is something you wish to confess, now is the time. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clink of a coffee cup as Lady Eleanor set it down too quickly. Poirot's eyes flicked to her, noting the slight flush in her cheeks. Was it guilt, or merely the strain of the investigation? Monsieur Poirot, Dr. Marlowe said, his voice calm but firm, this charade is growing tiresome. You've made your point about your so-called method, but where is the evidence? You can't expect us to sit here and confess to something we didn't do. Poirot raised an eyebrow, his expression unperturbed. Patience, doctor. The evidence is there, and my method will bring it to light. But tell me, why are you so eager to dismiss it? Does it make you uncomfortable? Marlowe's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Poirot turned to Clara, who was sipping her coffee with an air of detachment. Mademoiselle Clara, you have been most cooperative, but I wonder, did you ever handle Lord Ashford's wine decanter that evening? Perhaps when you were tidying his study earlier. Clara's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. No, Monsieur Poirot, I had no reason to touch the decanter. My duties were clerical, not domestic. Beans, sir, Poirot said, nodding. But he noted the way her fingers tightened around her cup, the briefest of hesitations before she spoke. It was subtle, but it was there. He moved on to Vernon, who was glaring at him from across the room. Monsieur Vernon, you have spoken of your disagreement with Lord Ashford, but was there more to it? Perhaps a threat, a warning that went beyond mere business. Vernon's face darkened. I told you, it was just a contract dispute. I didn't threaten him, and I certainly didn't poison him. You're barking up the wrong tree, Poirot. Perhaps, Poirot said, his tone mild, but my method will tell me if you speak the truth. The morning continued in this vein, with Poirot asking pointed questions, dropping hints about his method, and watching for reactions. He noticed Charles's growing irritability, the way he snapped at a servant who spilled a drop of coffee. Lady Eleanor's nervous glances toward Dr. Marlowe suggested a connection Poirot had yet to fully explore. And Clara's calm was beginning to crack, her answers becoming shorter, her movements more deliberate, as if she were consciously controlling every gesture. By midday, Poirot called a break, allowing the suspects to disperse. He retreated to the garden, where he could think in solitude. The manicured hedges and blooming roses were a stark contrast to the turmoil within the manor, and Poirot found the orderliness soothing. He walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind sifting through the morning's observations. Clara's composure was the most intriguing. It was too perfect, too practiced. A truly innocent person, Poirot knew, would show some natural variation in their demeanor, moments of frustration, sadness, or even boredom. But Clara's calm was a mask, and masks, Poirot had learned, were worn to hide something. He recalled the burn mark on the desk, the clue that had been nagging at him. If it was indeed caused by a chemical reaction from the poison, it suggested a moment of carelessness, a mistake made by someone who was otherwise meticulous. Clara, with her access to the study and her knowledge of Ashford's routines, was a strong candidate. But Dr. Marlowe's expertise in poisons could not be ignored, nor could Lady Eleanor's nervous behavior, which might indicate complicity. Poirot's genius trick was working. He was certain of it. The pressure was mounting, and the guilty party would soon make a mistake. He returned to the manor, determined to push further, to tighten the net around the liar. That afternoon, Poirot staged another test. He requested that the suspects join him in the study, the scene of the crime. The room was as it had been, save for the removal of Lord Ashford's body. The desk, with its telltale burn mark, stood in the centre. The half-empty wine glass, still on a side table, preserved for evidence. I wish to recreate the moments leading up to Lord Ashford's death, Poirot announced. Each of you will take your place as you were that evening. I will observe, and my method will do the rest. The suspects complied, though with varying degrees of reluctance. Lady Eleanor stood near the door, as she had been when she last spoke to her husband. Charles sat in a chair by the window, claiming he had been there during the dinner. Dr. Marlowe positioned himself near the bookshelf, Clara near the desk, and Vernon by the fireplace. Poirot moved among them, asking questions about their movements, their conversations, their observations. He watched their hands, their eyes, their breathing. When he mentioned the wine glass, Clara's gaze flicked to it for a fraction of a second before she looked away. When he pointed to the burn mark, Dr. Marlowe's fingers twitched, as if resisting the urge to touch it. Interesting, Poirot murmured, loud enough for all to hear. My method reveals much, even in silence. The tension in the room was palpable, a taut wire ready to snap. Poirot knew he was close. The liar was among them, and his genius trick was forcing them to the edge. All he needed was one more push, one more moment of weakness, and the truth would come tumbling out as the day drew to a close. Poirot gathered the suspects one final time in the drawing-room. The fire was low now, the shadows deeper, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. He stood before them, his posture erect, his eyes gleaming with purpose. "Mies Amos," he said, his voice low and commanding, "the time for games is over. My method has done its work, and I am close to the truth. But I offer one final chance. If the guilty party wishes to confess, I will listen. If not, I will reveal what I have seen, and the consequences will follow." The silence was deafening. Poirot's eyes moved from face to face, searching for the telltale signs. Lady Eleanor's breath hitched. Charles's cigarette trembled in his hand. Dr. Marlowe's jaw clenched. Vernon's fists tightened, and Clara's calm mask slipped. Just for a moment, as her eyes widened in fear. Poirot smiled inwardly. The genius trick had worked. The liar was unravelling, and soon the truth would be his. Chapter 9. A False Confession. The dining room of Ashford Manor was heavy with the weight of suspicion, its air thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint, lingering aroma of the dinner that had been so abruptly interrupted by Lord Reginald. Ashford's death. The long mahogany table, now cleared of its fine china and silverware, stood as a silent witness to the tension that had gripped the guests since that fateful evening. The chandelier above cast a soft, golden glow, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill of mistrust that hung over the room. Hercule Poirot, immaculate in his tailored suit, his moustache perfectly waxed, stood at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the assembled suspects. Each one sat rigidly, their postures betraying varying degrees of unease, guilt, or defiance. The events of the past few days had unfolded like a tightly wound spring, each revelation coiling the tension tighter. Poirot had announced his foolproof method to detect lies at the close of the previous evening, a pronouncement that had sent ripples of unease through the group. It was a calculated move, a psychological gambit designed to unsettle the guilty party. Now, as the clock on the mantelpiece ticked toward 9 in the evening, the moment had come to see the fruits of his strategy. The suspects, Lady Eleanor, Charles, Dr. Marlowe, Miss Clara, and Mr. Vernon, sat in their assigned seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity, fear, and guarded suspicion. Poirot's reputation preceded him, and none doubted that the little Belgian detective was capable of unravelling even the most intricate of mysteries. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, his head tilted slightly as he surveyed the room. "Mies Amos," he began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "We find ourselves at a crossroads in this investigation. The death of Lord Ashford was no accident, no mere misfortune. It was a murder planned with precision and executed with audacity. And yet the truth remains elusive, hidden behind the masks you all wear so well." Lady Eleanor, seated to Poirot's right, shifted in her chair, her delicate hands twisting the lace handkerchief she held. Her pale blue eyes darted toward her nephew Charles, who sat opposite her, his jaw set in a defiant line. Dr. Marlowe, the family friend and physician, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his face a study in calm detachment. Miss Clara, the secretary, sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable, though her lips were pressed into a thin line. Mr. Vernon, the businessman with a grudge against Ashford, tapped his fingers on the table, his impatience barely concealed. Poirot paced slowly along the length of the table, his polished shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. "Last night," he continued, "I spoke of a method, a technique that would reveal the liar among you. A method that observes the smallest of details, the flicker of an eye, the tremor of a hand, the hesitation in a voice. These are the signs that betray the heart, even when the tongue speaks falsehoods. And today, mes amis, we shall see who among you falters under the weight of truth. The room seemed to hold its breath. Charles, the ambitious nephew, suddenly leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His face was flushed, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and frustration. "This is absurd," he burst out, his voice cracking. "All this talk of tricks and methods, it's nothing but theatrics. I can't stand it any longer." Poirot stopped, pacing, and turned to face Charles, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Monsieur Charles," he said softly, "you seem most agitated. Perhaps you have something to share with us." The young man's chest heaved as he glanced around the room, his gaze flickering from one face to another. Lady Eleanor's eyes widened, and she reached out a trembling hand toward him. "Charles, darling, please calm yourself." But Charles shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "No, Aunt Eleanor, I can't keep silent any longer. I did it. I tampered with the wine." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lady Eleanor let out a soft cry, her hand flying to her mouth. Dr. Marlowe's eyebrows shot up, his calm facade cracking for the first time. Miss Clara's expression remained impassive, though her fingers tightened slightly around each other. Mr. Vernon leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. Poirot, however, did not react with surprise. Instead, he tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he studied Charles. "Mon cher Charles," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "this is a most interesting revelation. You say you tampered with the wine. Pray, tell us more. How did you do this, and to what end?" Charles swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I didn't mean for it to happen this way," he stammered. "I was angry with Uncle Reginald. He was going to cut me out of the will, you see. I overheard him talking to his solicitor about it, about leaving everything to that damned charity. I thought if I could make him ill, just for a little while, it would give me time to change his mind. So I slipped something into his wine during dinner. A sedative, that's all. I swear I didn't know it was poisoned." The room erupted into murmurs. Lady Eleanor's face crumpled, and she buried her face in her handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Dr. Marlowe leaned forward, his voice sharp, a sedative. "Charles, do you have any idea what you're saying? The poison that killed Lord Ashford was no mere sedative, was a rare toxin, one that requires expertise to procure and administer." "Indeed," Poirot interjected, raising a hand to silence the room. "Dr. Marlowe speaks truly. The poison found in Lord Ashford's body was not a common sedative, but a substance far more sinister, one that suggests a knowledge of chemistry or pharmacology. Monsieur Charles, are you telling us you have such expertise?" Charles shook his head vehemently, his face pale. "No, I swear, I only used a sleeping draught I found in the Manners medicine cabinet. I thought it would make him drowsy, nothing more. I didn't know it would kill him." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest, though his expression remained inscrutable. He stepped closer to Charles, his voice low and measured. "And where, pray tell, did you obtain this sleeping draught? Who else had access to this medicine?" "Cabinet." Charles hesitated, his eyes darting toward Miss Clara, then quickly away. "It was just there, in the study. I saw it when I was looking for some papers a few days ago. I don't know who else might have used it." Poirot's gaze followed Charles's fleeting glance toward Clara, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Very well," he said, stepping back. Your confession, Monsieur Charles, is noted. But I must ask you to remain here, for there are still many questions to be answered. The detective turned to the others, his demeanor calm but commanding. This confession, Ms. Amos, is a piece of the puzzle, but it is not the whole picture. The poison that killed Lord Ashford was no accident, no mistake by an amateur. It was chosen with care, administered with precision, and the first Hercule Poirot do not believe that Monsieur Charles has the knowledge or the cunning to execute such a plan alone. Charles's face flushed with a mix of relief and indignation. What are you saying? That I'm lying? Poirot raised an eyebrow. I am saying, monsieur, that your story is incomplete. Perhaps you tampered with the wine, as you claim. Perhaps you even believe you caused your uncle's death. But the truth, it is deeper, more complex, and I shall find it. The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words settling over the group like a shroud. Lady Eleanor's sobs had quieted, but her eyes remained fixed on her nephew, filled with a mixture of fear and pity. Dr. Marlowe's expression had returned to its usual calm, though his fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the table. Miss Clara, however, seemed to withdraw further into herself, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the room. Poirot resumed his pacing, his mind working rapidly. Charles's confession had been unexpected, but it did not surprise him entirely. The young man's agitation, his quickness to speak, suggested a guilty conscience, but not necessarily a guilty hand. Poirot had seen such confessions before. A suspect, overwhelmed by pressure, admits to a lesser crime to deflect suspicion from a greater one, or to protect another. The question was, who was Charles protecting, if anyone, and why had his glance flickered toward Miss Clara? The detective's thoughts turned to the burn mark on the desk, the half-empty glass of wine, the open window with no footprints. These were the pieces of the puzzle that did not yet fit the clues that pointed to a more intricate scheme. The poison, as Dr. Marlowe had noted, was rare, requiring expertise to obtain and use. Charles, with his limited education and impulsive nature, seemed an unlikely candidate for such a sophisticated crime. But someone in this room, someone with access to the study, knowledge of poisons, and a motive to silence Lord Ashford, had orchestrated the murder. Poirot stopped pacing and turned to face the group once more. Let us consider the facts, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Lord Ashford was poisoned during dinner, in a room locked from the inside. The wine, we now know, was tampered with perhaps by Monsieur Charles, perhaps by another, but the poison was not a sedative, as Charles claims, but a toxin of a most specific nature. Who among you had the means to obtain such a substance? Who had the opportunity to place it in the wine? Dr. Marlowe cleared his throat, his voice steady. As a physician, I am familiar with many compounds, but I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, I had no hand in this. My knowledge is used to heal, not to harm. Poirot nodded, though his eyes remained sharp. And yet, doctor, your expertise cannot be ignored, nor can the fact that you were seen in the manor earlier that day, near the study where the crime occurred. Dr. Marlowe's composure faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained it. I was checking on Lord Ashford's health, as I often did. He had been complaining of fatigue. Indeed, Poirot said, his tone neutral. And you, mademoiselle Clara, you, too, were in the manor before the dinner. As Lord Ashford's secretary, he had access to his private quarters, his papers, his secrets. What can you tell us of your movements that day? Clara's eyes met Poirot's, steady and unyielding. I was working, Monsieur Poirot, sorting correspondence, preparing documents. My duties often took me to the study, but I saw nothing unusual. Poirot smiled faintly. Nothing unusual, you say? And yet, mademoiselle, you overheard an argument between Lord Ashford and Monsieur Vernon. A heated exchange, Nan. One that spoke of betrayal and broken promises. Clara's lips parted slightly, but she quickly recovered. I mentioned that to you in confidence, Monsieur Poirot. It was a private matter, nothing more, perhaps, Poirot said, his voice soft but probing. But in a murder investigation, mademoiselle, there are no private matters. Every word, every glance, every secret hit, all matters. The room grew tense once more, the suspects exchanging uneasy glances. Mr. Vernon, who had been silent for much of the exchange, finally spoke, his voice rough with irritation. This is ridiculous. You're grasping at straws, Poirot. If Charles says he did it, then arrest him and be done with it. Why drag the rest of us through this charade? Poirot turned to Vernon, his eyes narrowing. Monsieur Vernon, your impatience is noted, but I do not arrest on the basis of a confession alone. The truth, it is like a fine tapestry thread, must be examined, each pattern understood, before the whole can be seen. And I assure you, I am very close to seeing the whole. The detective's words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. Charles's confession had shaken the group, but Poirot knew it was only the beginning. The true killer was still in this room, watching, waiting, perhaps even believing they had outwitted him. But Hercule Poirot was not so easily deceived. His foolproof method was no scientific marvel, no mechanical device. It was the power of observation, the understanding of human nature, amplified by a carefully crafted bluff. And as he watched the suspects, their faces betraying their fears and secrets, he knew that the next move would bring him closer to the truth. The evening wore on, and Poirot continued his questioning, probing each suspect with precision. He asked Lady Eleanor about her husband's mood in the days before his death, noting her hesitation when she spoke of their strained marriage. He pressed Dr. Marlowe on his knowledge of rare poisons, observing the faint flush that crept up the doctor's neck. He questioned Mr. Vernon about his failed business deal with Ashford, watching as the man's temper flared. And he circled back to Miss Clara, asking about her duties, her access to the study, her knowledge of Ashford's secrets. With each question, Poirot's mind worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of the case. The burn mark on the desk suggested a chemical spill, an accident that the killer had not anticipated. The locked room pointed to a hidden means of entry, perhaps a passage known only to someone familiar with the manor's secrets. And Charles's confession, while dramatic, did not account for the sophistication of the poison or the planning required to execute the crime. As the clock struck 10, Poirot stepped back, his hands clasped behind him. "Mes amis," he said, his voice steady, "we have made progress this evening, but the truth remains just out of reach. Monsieur Charles has confessed to tampering with the wine, but I believe his confession is but a shadow of the truth, a distraction, perhaps, to protect another or to obscure a greater crime. Tomorrow we shall reconvene, and I shall reveal more of my method. Until then, I advise you all to reflect on your actions, your words, your secrets. For the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot, they do not rest." The suspects rose, their movements slow and uncertain, as if reluctant to leave the safety of the dining room. Lady Eleanor clung to Charles's arm, whispering something in his ear. Dr. Marlowe exchanged a glance with Mr. Vernon, who shook his head in frustration. Miss Clara lingered for a moment, her eyes meeting Poirot's once more before she turned and left the room. Poirot remained behind, his gaze fixed on the empty table. The confession had been a turning point, but it was not the end. The killer was clever, but they had made mistakes: the burn mark, the locked room, the choice of poison. And Poirot, with his unparalleled ability to see what others missed, was closing in. The genius trick, the bluff that had prompted Charles's outburst, was only the beginning. The next step would require even greater precision, a tighter net, to catch the true liar. As the manor settled into an uneasy silence, Poirot's mind buzzed with possibilities. The truth was there, hidden in the details, waiting to be uncovered by the little grey cells that never failed him. Chapter 10. The Burn Mark. Clutham morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Ashford Manor, casting a golden hue across the grand dining room where Hercule Poirot sat, his small, precise hands folded neatly in his lap. The air was thick, with the scent of polished wood and the faint, lingering aroma of last night's dinner, now a distant memory overshadowed by the grim events that had unfolded. The death of Lord Reginald Ashford had transformed the opulent estate into a stage for suspicion, and Poirot, with his meticulous mind, was determined to unravel the threads of deception that bound the guests together. He sipped his coffee, the delicate porcelain cup clinking softly against its saucer, and surveyed the room. The guests had gathered for breakfast, though the mood was far from convivial. Lady Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her face pale and her fingers clutching a napkin as though it were a lifeline. Charles, the ambitious nephew, pushed his eggs round his plate, his jaw tight and his eyes darting nervously. Dr. Marlowe, ever the composed physician, buttered his toast with an almost clinical precision, while Miss Clara, the secretary, sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Mr. Vernon, the rival businessman, was absent, having excused himself to make a phone call, a detail Poirot noted with interest. The events of the previous evening weighed heavily on Poirot's mind. Charles's confession to tampering with the wine had been a surprising twist, but Poirot's instincts told him it was a half-truth, a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion. The poison used to kill Lord Ashford was no ordinary toxin. It was rare, sophisticated, and required expertise far beyond Charles's capabilities. No, the true culprit was still at large, hiding behind a carefully constructed facade. And then there was the burn mark on the desk, a curious anomaly that had piqued Poirot's curiosity from the moment he first examined the locked study. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and graceful, and excused himself from the table. "Messieurs, et madame," he said, his voice calm but commanding attention, "I shall return shortly. There is a matter in the study that requires my attention." The guests exchanged glances, some curious, others apprehensive, but none dared question the diminutive detective as he left the room. The study was as he had left it, sealed off by the local constable at Poirot's request to preserve the crime scene. The heavy oak door creaked as he pushed it open, and he stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the desk where Lord Ashford's body had been found. The room was a portrait of order disrupted, books neatly shelved, papers stacked with precision. And yet, at the centre of it all, the desk bore the scars of the crime. A half-empty glass of wine sat untouched, its contents now analysed and confirmed to contain the deadly poison. The open window, through which no footprints had been found, hinted at an impossible crime. And then there was the burn marker small. irregular scorch on the polished mahogany surface, no larger than a shilling but impossibly out of place. Poirot knelt beside the desk, his monocle gleaming as he examined the mark closely. It was not the result of a cigarette or a candle. The edges were too precise, the discoloration too uniform. He traced his finger lightly over the surface, noting the faint chemical odor that lingered, almost imperceptible but unmistakable to his trained senses. Mon Dieu, he murmured, his mind racing. This is no accident. This is a clue, a whisper from the crime itself. He stood and paced the room, his steps measured, his hands clasped behind his back. The burn mark was the key, he was certain of it, but what did it signify? A chemical spill, perhaps, from the poison itself. The toxin used to kill Ashford was a rare alkaloid, one that Poirot had encountered only once before in his long career, a case involving a chemist who had underestimated the detective's tenacity. Such a poison could react with certain surfaces, particularly if mishandled. If the killer had spilled even a drop while preparing the fatal dose, it could have left this marker careless mistake in an otherwise meticulous plan. But who had access to the study before the dinner? The timeline was critical. Lord Ashford had been alive and well during the early evening, greeting his guests with his usual pomp and circumstance. The dinner had begun at 7 o'clock, and it was not until 9:30 that the butler had discovered the body. The poison, according to Dr. Marlowe's preliminary analysis, would have taken effect within minutes, meaning the fatal dose had been administered shortly before Ashford's death. The locked door and the absence of footprints outside the window suggested the killer had been inside the manor, perhaps even in the study. Before the guests gathered, Poirot's thoughts turned to the two individuals who had been in the manor. Earlier that day, Miss Clara, the secretary, who had been working on correspondence in the library, and Dr. Marlowe, who had visited Ashford under the pretense of a routine medical check. Both had opportunity, but did they have the means and motive? Clara's connection to the mysterious charity mentioned in Ashford's secret will was troubling. If she had been skimming funds, as Poirot suspected, Ashford's discovery of her deceit would have given her a powerful reason to silence him. Dr. Marlowe, on the other hand, had the expertise to procure and administer such a poison, and his calm demeanor during the investigation suggested either innocence or a chilling confidence. Poirot returned to the desk, his eyes narrowing as he considered the wine-glass. The poison had been delivered through the wine. That much was certain, but the burn mark suggested a moment of carelessness. Had the killer prepared the poison in the study, perhaps mixing it into the wine before Ashford entered? The open window could have been a distraction, a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators into believing an outsider was responsible. But the absence of footprints in the soft earth outside told Poirot that no one had entered or exited through the window. The killer had been inside all along. He moved to the bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines of the leather-bound volumes. Ashford had been a meticulous man, his study a reflection of his orderly mind. Yet something felt amiss. Poirot's gaze fell on a small, ornate box tucked between two books, its surface gleaming in the morning light. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of fountain pens and a small vial of ink. The ink bottle was nearly empty, its cap slightly askew, as though it had been recently used. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. Perhaps, he mused, the ink is not ink at all. He removed the vial and held it to the light, noting its faint, acrid scent. It was not ink but a chemical, possibly a solvent or a reagent used in the preparation of the poison. If the killer had used this very vial to mix the toxin, A spill could have caused the burn mark on the desk. But why leave such a damning piece of evidence behind? Arrogance, perhaps, or haste. Poirot replaced the vial and made a mental note to have it analyzed by the local chemist, though he suspected he already knew its contents. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Lady Eleanor standing in the doorway, her face drawn and her hands clasped tightly together. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice trembling, "have you found anything? The uncertainty is unbearable." Poirot regarded her with his usual courtesy, though his eyes missed nothing. Her nervousness was palpable, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. "Madame," he said gently, "the truth is like a puzzle, and I am assembling the pieces. Tell me, did you visit your husband's study yesterday before the dinner?" Her eyes widened slightly, and she shook her head. "No, I was in the drawing room with the guests. I had no reason to come here." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And Miss Clara, or Dr. Marlowe, did you see either of them near the study?" Lady Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor. I don't recall. Clara was in the library, I think, and Dr. Marlowe was with Reginald earlier, but I didn't see them here." "Merci, madame," Poirot said, dismissing her with a polite nod. Her hesitation was telling, though whether it stemmed from guilt or fear, he could not yet determine. He made a mental note to press her further later, perhaps during his next staged provocation. As Lady Eleanor retreated, Poirot returned to his examination of the room. The burn mark, the vial, the locked door all pointed to a killer who was both cunning and fallible. Clara's calm demeanour during the reenactment of the dinner had intrigued him, while Vernon had grown agitated, betraying his unease. Clara's composure had been almost unnatural. Was it the confidence of innocence, or the calculated restraint of a guilty mind? Poirot's mind drifted to his psychological trick, the foolproof method he had announced to unsettle the suspects. It was a bluff, of course, but a carefully crafted one, by claiming to possess a method to detect lies through involuntary physical cues. He had planted a seed of doubt in the killer's mind. The guilty party would be watching him closely, fearing exposure, and their reactions would betray them. Clara's calm facade, he suspected, was a mask, one that might crack under further pressure. He left the study and returned to the dining room, where the guests were finishing their breakfast. Charles looked up as Poirot entered, his face pale. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice strained, "have you made any progress? This confession of mine, it's eating at me." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his tone mild but probing. "Monsieur Charles, your confession was most illuminating, but incomplete, I think. The poison in the wine was not a simple matter of tampering. It required knowledge, precision. Tell me, do you know of anyone with access to rare chemicals?" Charles shook his head vigorously. "No, I swear it. I only meant to make him ill, to delay his plans. I didn't know about the poison." Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing. Charles's story was plausible but convenient, a distraction from the true culprit. He turned his attention to Dr. Marlowe, who was sipping his coffee with an air of detachment. Dr. Poirot said, "Your expertise in medicine is well known. Tell me, have you ever encountered a poison that might leave a burn mark on a wooden surface?" Dr. Marlowe's hand paused mid-sip, and for a fraction of a second, his composure faltered. "A burn mark," he repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "Certain alkaloids, if mishandled, could cause a chemical reaction with wood, but I'd need more details to say for certain." Poirot smiled faintly, noting the doctor's quick recovery. "Of course," he said. "I shall provide those details in due time." His gaze shifted to Miss Clara, who was quietly buttering a piece of toast. "Mademoiselle Clara," he said, his voice soft but piercing, "you were in the library yesterday afternoon, were you not? Did you perhaps visit the study to deliver papers to Lord Ashford?" Clara's hand froze, her knife hovering above. The toast, I may have stopped by briefly, she said, her voice steady but her eyes flickering with unease. "I often brought him correspondence. It was nothing unusual," Poirot nodded, his expression inscrutable. "And did you notice anything unusual in the study? A vial, perhaps, or a strange odour?" Clara shook her head, her composure returning. "No, nothing like that. It was just as it always was." Poirot let the matter drop, but his mind was alight with possibilities. Clara's brief hesitation, her carefully measured responses, suggested she was hiding something. The vial in the study, the burn mark, her presence in the manor before the dinner, all pointed to her as a key figure in the puzzle. But Dr. Marlowe's knowledge of poisons could not be ignored, nor could Lady Eleanor's nervous demeanour or Vernon's agitation. As the morning wore on, Poirot retreated to the library to review his notes. He spread out a sheet of paper, his neat handwriting cataloguing every detail of the case: the locked room, the poison, the burn mark, the suspects' alibis, and their reactions to his psychological trick. The burn mark was the linchpin, he decided. It was a mistake, a moment of carelessness that the killer had not anticipated. If he could confirm its connection to the poison, he could narrow the suspects to Clara or Dr. Marlowe, perhaps both. Working in concert, he summoned the butler, a stoic man named Hawkins, who had served the Ashford family for decades. "Monsieur Hawkins," Poirot said, "tell me about the study. Was it cleaned or disturbed in any way before the dinner?" Hawkins frowned, his brow furrowing. "No, sir. The study was locked all afternoon, as per Lord Ashford's instructions. Only he, Miss Clara, and Dr. Marlowe had keys, and I saw no one else enter." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And the vial of ink on the desk, was it there before the dinner?" Hawkins hesitated. "I believe so, sir. Lord Ashford was particular about his writing materials, but I didn't notice anything unusual about it." Dismissed the butler with a nod, his mind racing. The vial was the key. He was certain of it. If it contained a chemical used to prepare the poison, it would point directly to the killer's identity. He made arrangements to have the vial sent to a chemist in the nearby town, along with a sample of the wine and a scraping from the burn mark. The results would take time, but Poirot was patient. The truth, he knew, would reveal itself in due course. In the meantime, he decided to intensify his psychological gambit. He gathered the guests in the drawing room that afternoon, his demeanour calm but authoritative. "Messieurs et mesdames," he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity, "I am close to uncovering the truth about Lord Ashford's death. The burn mark on the desk, you see, is no ordinary mark. It is a signature, a trace left by the killer's hand. And I have a method, a most ingenious method, to identify the one who left it." The room fell silent, the guests' faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and suspicion. Clara's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Dr. Marlowe's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on Poirot. Charles shifted uncomfortably, while Lady Eleanor's gaze darted nervously around the room. Vernon, who had rejoined the group, crossed his arms, his jaw set. Poirot continued, his voice measured. "The method, It is scientific, precise. It detects the smallest signs of guilt, changes in the pulse, the dilation of the pupils, the tremor of the hand. No one can hide from it, not even the most clever among you. He watched their reactions closely, noting Clara's slight intake of breath, Dr. Marlowe's steady gaze, and Vernon's clenched fists. The seed of doubt had been planted, and now he would wait for it to bear fruit. The killer, he knew, was among them, and the burn mark was the key to unmasking them. As the guests dispersed, Poirot returned to the study, his mind a whirlwind of deductions. The burn mark, the vial, the locked room were pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. Clara's presence in the manor, her connection to the charity, and her composure under pressure made her the prime suspect. But Dr. Marlowe's expertise and Lady Eleanor's nervousness could not be discounted. The truth was close, tantalizingly close, and Poirot's little grey cells were working tirelessly to uncover it. He sat at the desk, his fingers steepled, and closed his eyes. The burn mark was no accident, he thought. It was a mistake, a moment of carelessness that would lead him to the killer. And when he found them, his genius tricked a bluff that had set the guilty party on edge would seal their fate.